The first light of dawn broke cold over the Montana peaks, painting the snow-covered ridges in shades of copper and gold. Daniel Morgan stood at the window of his bedroom, watching the sun climb behind the distant mountains, his breath fogging the glass. 5 o'clock, same as every morning for the past 20 years. Some habits ran deeper than reason, carved into a man's bones by necessity and discipline. He dressed in the dark, pulling on wool pants and a flannel shirt worn soft with age. His fingers moved automatically, buttoning and tucking the motions as familiar as breathing. On the dresser beside him sat a wooden box walnut darkened by years of handling. Dan paused, his hand hovering over it for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside lay a Colt 45 Peacemaker, its steel surface dulled with time, but still perfectly maintained. 6 chambers, empty as they had been for 3 years. Beside the revolver rested a faded photograph in a tin frame. 3 faces smiled back at him. A woman with gentle eyes and dark hair, a boy of 7 with a gap-toothed grin, and himself younger, his face not yet carved with the lines of grief. Dan lifted the gun, feeling its familiar weight. He checked the cylinder out of habit, though he knew it held no bullets. The metal was cold against his palm. He set it back in the box without loading it, as he had done every morning since the day he buried them. Next to the gun lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Dan opened it carefully, finding the place marked with a strip of cloth. His father's handwriting, strong and steady, filled the page. June 10th, 1870. My son, if you read these words, know this. A gun does not make a man. Responsibility does. Protect the weak, keep your word, build something that lasts beyond your days. Dan read the passage slowly, letting each word settle. His father had written those lines the summer before he died, leaving behind wisdom intended for a son who had needed guidance. William Morgan had been many things: farmer, builder, father. But above all, he had been a man who understood that legacy was measured not in acres or cattle, but in what a man taught those who came after. Dan closed the journal and set it beside the gun. The morning ritual complete, he turned to the faded photograph on the wall behind the dresser. 4 people this time. His grandfather stern-faced and broad-shouldered. His grandmother small but fierce. His parents young and hopeful. And at the bottom, written in his father's careful script, Morgan Ranch, established 1855. 63 years, 3 generations had worked this land, carved a life from the wilderness when Montana was still wild territory. His grandfather had staked the claim with nothing but determination and a wagon full of dreams. His father had built the stone cabin, raising walls that would stand against any storm. And now Dan held it all, 160 acres of meadow and timber, trying to honor what they had built. He walked downstairs, boots echoing on the wooden steps. The main room was large, built to hold a family that no longer existed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the hearth wide enough to roast a whole pig. Shelves lined another wall, filled with books on farming, animal husbandry, and Montana law. A large table stood in the center, carved by his father from a single oak trunk scarred by decades of use. Dan kindled the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. The ritual of it soothed him. Wood, tinder, patience. The same elements his grandfather had used to survive that first terrible winter of 1855, when the snow had reached the cabin roof and food had run so low that they ate the leather from their boots. Outside, the December wind howled, rattling the shutters. Dan poured coffee from the pot he had prepared the night before, reheating it over the fire. The bitter taste grounded him, brought him fully into the day. He was reaching for his coat when he heard the sound of hooves approaching. Dan's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle above the fireplace before he recognized the familiar rhythm. 1 horse, steady gait. The postman making his rounds. Dan opened the door as Henry Crawford dismounted, his weathered face red from the cold. The old man had been delivering mail to these mountain ranches for 30 years, knew every family within 50 miles. Morning, Dan. Got something from the courthouse in Helena. Dan took the envelope, noting the official seal. His name was typed across the front in neat block letters. Daniel Morgan, Morgan Ranch, Coldwater, Montana. Bad news, Henry asked, reading Dan's expression. Don't know yet. Dan turned the envelope over, examining the seal. Coffee? Can't. Got 20 more stops before noon. Henry swung back into the saddle, then paused. You take care now. Winter's shaping up mean. Dan watched the postman ride away before breaking the seal. The letter inside was typed on legal paper, formal and cold. Notice of land dispute. The Yellowstone Land Company hereby claims ownership of 80 acres of the property known as Morgan Ranch based on documented sale dated March 5, 1888. Legal action will commence if this matter is not resolved within 30 days. Dan read it twice, his jaw tightening. 80 acres, half his land, and a sale dated 1888 that he had never made. The paper included a copy of the supposed deed. Dan studied it, his heart sinking. The signature at the bottom read Daniel Morgan in a hand that looked remarkably like his own. But he had never signed this document, never even seen it before today. Someone had forged his name. Someone wanted his land badly enough to commit fraud. Dan thought of the coming spring when the railroad was scheduled to break ground on the new line through northern Montana. He had heard rumors in town. Land along the proposed route was increasing in value, sometimes 20-fold overnight. Men were making fortunes buying cheap property and selling it to the railroad companies. But Dan had never considered his remote ranch valuable. It was too far from town, the terrain too rough for easy farming. What could anyone want with half of Morgan Ranch, unless they knew something he didn't? Dan folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. He needed to see Sheriff Tom Barrett. Now. The ride to Coldwater took 40 minutes through snow that had drifted waist-high in places. Dan's horse, a gray gelding named Smoke, picked his way carefully down the mountain trail, breath steaming in the frozen air. The forest pressed close on either side, pine and spruce, heavy with snow, silent, except for the occasional crack of a breaking branch. Dan used the time to think. 1888, 4 years ago. He had been married to Elizabeth, then Jacob, only 3 years old. They had been building their life together, expanding the herd, planning for more children. He would have remembered signing away half his property. The trail opened onto the main road and Coldwater came into view. The town was small, maybe 200 souls, but it served as the hub for all the ranches in the surrounding mountains. A general store, a saloon, a church, a small bank, and the sheriff's office. Enough to keep a community alive through the long winters. Dan tied Smoke outside the sheriff's office and pushed through the door. Heat from a potbelly stove hit him immediately, along with the smell of coffee and tobacco. Tom Barrett looked up from his desk, his weathered face creasing into a smile that faded when he saw Dan's expression. Trouble. Dan handed him the letter without a word. Barrett was 55, a former marshal who had come to Montana to retire, but found himself wearing a badge anyway. He had known Dan for 8 years, had been there the day they buried Elizabeth and Jacob. He was one of the few people in Coldwater who knew what Dan had been before he became a rancher. The sheriff read the letter slowly, his frown deepening. When he finished, he looked up, meeting Dan's eyes. You signed this? No. Thought not. Barrett set the letter on his desk. I've been hearing things. The Yellowstone Land Company. Months ago, started buying property all through the valley. Cash offers, generous terms. Some folks took the money. And those who didn't got letters like this. Barrett leaned back in his chair. I looked into it. Yellowstone Land Company doesn't exist, at least not the way they claim. It's a shell. Someone's using it to hide. Who? Don't know yet, but I have suspicions. Barrett pulled a newspaper from his desk drawer. This came from Wyoming last week. Dan took the paper, his eyes scanning the headline. Sheriff under investigation for theft. Marcus Hayes accused of embezzling $500 from county fund. Keep reading. Dan's eyes moved down the page. Hayes' wife and 3 children disappeared the same night the theft was discovered. Authorities believe she may have fled with evidence. Hayes claims his family was kidnapped. Investigation ongoing. Dan looked up, understanding dawning. You think Hayes is involved in this land grab? Think a desperate man will do desperate things. Barrett tapped the newspaper. $500 is a lot of money to lose, especially if it wasn't his to begin with. A man like that might need somewhere to hide. Might need a new source of income. Montana's a long way from Wyoming. Not if you're running. Barrett stood walking to the window. I sent a telegram to the marshal in Cheyenne. Asked about Hayes. Got back some interesting information. Seems our sheriff has a reputation. Violent temper, history of brutality. 3 complaints filed against him for excessive force, all dismissed. Dan felt cold settle in his gut. His wife. No official reports, but the marshal I talked to said everyone knew. Sarah Hayes wore long sleeves in summer, kept her children close, didn't socialize much, and nobody did anything. He was the law. Who would they report him to? Barrett turned back to Dan. I'm telling you this because I think Sarah Hayes might be heading this way. And if she is, Marcus won't be far behind. Dan thought of Elizabeth, of the promise he had made, standing over her grave. Never again would he let someone die because he was too slow, too far away, too late. If she comes, she'll need help. She will. Barrett met his eyes. But Dan, you need to be careful. Your past is quiet here. People forgot who you were. Marcus Hayes showing up asking questions that could change things. Dan knew what Barrett meant. The Montana ghost. 12 men dead in one night in Deadwood. The legend that had driven him from South Dakota to this quiet corner of Montana seeking peace he wasn't sure he deserved. I'm not that man anymore. I know, but the world doesn't forget easy. Barrett handed him back the letter. You got 30 days to respond to this. I'll keep digging, see what I can find. Meanwhile, watch your back. Dan left the sheriff's office, the December wind biting through his coat. The town was quiet, most people staying indoors away from the cold. He was about to mount smoke when voices drew his attention. Across the street outside William Fletcher's general store, a small group had gathered. Dan could see Fletcher gesturing angrily, his voice carrying despite the wind. I said no handouts, move along. Dan walked closer, curiosity pulling him forward. The crowd parted and he saw them. A woman thin and worn her coat too light for the weather. 3 children pressed against her sides. A boy of maybe 9 trying to stand tall despite the cold. 2 little girls, their faces pinched with hunger and fear. The woman's voice was soft, pleading. Please, just some bread. I can pay next week. I've heard that before. Fletcher's face was hard. No credit, no charity. That's my policy. The boy stepped forward, small fists clenched. My mother doesn't beg. She's offering honest work. Work, Fletcher laughed. What work can a woman and 3 brats do for me? Get out of here before I call the sheriff. The boy's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to say something more, but the woman pulled him back, her eyes full of shame and desperation. Dan stood frozen watching the scene unfold. And then he saw it. The way the boy positioned himself between his mother and Fletcher. The way his small body tensed, ready to fight despite being hopelessly outmatched. The fierce, protective love in his young face. Jacob had looked like that once. The day a drunk cowboy had gotten rough with Elizabeth in town. Jacob, only 6 years old, had stepped between them, fists raised, face set with determination. Dan had pulled him back, handled the cowboy himself. But he had been proud. His son knew how to protect those he loved. This boy, this stranger's son, wore that same expression. And Dan felt something crack open in his chest, a place that had been frozen for 3 years. He walked forward, his boots crunching in the snow. The crowd turned to look at him. Some recognized him. The quiet man from the mountain ranch who came to town once a month for supplies and nothing more. Fletcher's expression shifted from anger to uncertainty. Dan reached into his coat and pulled out 2 silver dollars. He set them on Fletcher's counter with a solid clink. Now they can pay. Fletcher swallowed hard, recognizing the tone in Dan's voice. It was not a request. Yes, of course. What do they want? Dan turned to the woman. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of gratitude and fear. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe 32. Her face was gaunt, but he could see she had once been pretty. Her hands shook as she clutched her children. Enough food for 2 weeks, Dan said. Bread, salt pork, beans, flour, and warm clothes for the children. That's more than $2 worth, Fletcher protested. Dan set down 2 more dollars. Now it's not. He watched as Fletcher, subdued, gathered the items. The woman stood silent, tears running down her thin face. The boy kept his eyes on Dan, wary and suspicious, trying to understand this stranger's motives. When Fletcher finished loading a canvas sack with supplies, Dan picked it up and handed it to the boy. Carry this for your mother. The boy took it, the weight of it making him stagger slightly, but he held on, jaw set with determination. Dan turned to the woman. Ma'am, do you have somewhere to stay? She shook her head, unable to speak. There's a storm coming. You won't survive a night outside. Dan paused, the words catching in his throat. He thought of Elizabeth, of the promise he had made. I have a cabin north of here, room enough. You and your children can shelter until the weather breaks. The woman found her voice barely a whisper. Why would you help us? Dan looked at her children, seeing Jacob in every line of their faces. Because winter doesn't ask why, and I won't let another soul freeze. He saw the moment she decided to trust him. Desperation overriding caution. She nodded just once. Collect your things. We leave now. The boy stepped between Dan and his mother, the sack of food still in his arms. We don't know you. Why should we trust you? Good question, smart boy. You shouldn't, Dan said honestly, but your mother is making a choice. Trust me or trust the storm. One might kill you, the other definitely will. The boy studied Dan's face for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. They had no things to collect. Everything they owned fit in a small bundle the woman carried. Dan led them to where smoke waited, steam rising from the horse's nostrils. The wagon, the woman said. We had a wagon, but the axle broke. I'll send someone for it later. Dan lifted the two little girls onto Smoke's broad back, wrapping his own coat around them. They were so light like birds, barely any weight at all. The older one, maybe 6, looked at him with huge brown eyes. What's your name? She asked. Daniel. People call me Dan. I'm Lily, that's Grace. She pointed to the younger girl who couldn't be more than 4. She doesn't talk much, she's scared. It's all right to be scared, Dan said gently. But you're safe now. He helped the woman up next to her daughters, then handed the food sack back to the boy. Can you walk? Yes, sir. They moved through Coldwater, Dan leading Smoke, the boy walking beside him. People watched from windows, curious and judgmental in equal measure. Dan ignored them all. Let them talk. Let them wonder. He was doing what needed to be done. The boy stayed quiet for the first mile, but Dan could feel him watching, evaluating, trying to understand. Finally, the boy spoke. Are you going to hurt us? No. Promise. Dan stopped walking and turned to face the boy. He knelt down in the snow, bringing himself to eye level. I promise. On my honor and my father's grave. I will not harm you or your mother or your sisters. You have my word. The boy searched Dan's face, looking for deception. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. He nodded. My name's Tommy. Good to meet you, Tommy. They walked on. The wind picked up swirling snow into patterns that danced across the trail. Dan felt the temperature dropping, saw the sky darkening to the north. The storm was coming faster than he had expected. Sir. Tommy's voice was small. How far is your cabin? About an hour, maybe more with the storm. Will we make it? Dan looked at the boy, saw the fear he was trying so hard to hide. We will, I promise. But even as he said it, the first real blast of wind hit them strong enough to make Smoke stumble. Dan grabbed the horse's bridle, steadying him. The woman cried out, clutching her daughters. The storm was here. The world turned white. Snow fell so thick that Dan could barely see Smoke's head in front of him. The wind screamed through the trees, turning the afternoon into twilight. Each step forward was a battle, the drifts rising to his knees. Behind him, Tommy struggled to keep up his small legs, fighting through snow that reached his waist. Dan turned back, grabbed the boy's arm, and pulled him forward. Stay close, don't let go. The woman hunched over her daughters, trying to shield them with her body. Lily had her face buried in her mother's shoulder. Grace was crying, the sound almost lost in the wind. Dan knew they had to find shelter. The cabin was still 40 minutes away in good weather. In this storm, it might as well be in Canada. If they kept going, they would freeze before they made it halfway. He scanned the landscape, looking for anything. A rock outcropping, a thick stand of trees, something to break the wind. But visibility was down to a few feet, and the familiar landmarks were buried in snow. Smoke suddenly pulled hard to the left, nearly jerking the reins from Dan's hands. The horse was sensing something, following an instinct Dan couldn't see. He let the animal lead, trusting the horse's survival sense. They stumbled forward another 100 yards. Smoke was moving with purpose, now his head down, fighting the wind. Then through the swirling white, Dan saw it. The dark mouth of a ravine cut deep into the hillside by centuries of runoff. Not perfect shelter, but better than the open trail. This way. He led them down into the ravine, the walls rising on either side, cutting the wind. It was still bitterly cold, but they could breathe without the storm tearing the air from their lungs. Dan helped the woman and children to down from Smoke, then quickly unpacked his bedroll and the supply sack. Working fast, he spread the bedroll against the most sheltered wall and wrapped the children in it, packing them together like nested dolls. The woman huddled beside her daughters, her lips blue with cold. Tommy stood apart, shivering violently but trying not to show it. "Come here," Dan said, pulling the boy close. No shame in being cold. He rubbed Tommy's arms vigorously, trying to restore circulation. The boy's hands were like ice. "I'm sorry," Tommy said through chattering teeth. "I should be stronger." "You carried that sack for a mile in a blizzard. That's stronger than most grown men." Dan pulled off his own gloves and put them on Tommy's hands. They were too big, but they were wool and dry. Being strong doesn't mean not feeling the cold. It means keeping going despite it. The woman was watching him, her eyes full of questions she was too exhausted to ask. "What's your name?" Dan asked. "Sarah. Sarah Hayes." Dan's hand froze in the act of tucking the bedroll tighter around Grace. "Hayes, Sheriff Barrett's newspaper." "The woman fleeing Wyoming with 3 children and stolen money." He looked at her more carefully. Saw the faded bruises on her wrists, partially hidden by her sleeves. The way she flinched when he moved too quickly. The protective way she positioned herself between him and her children. Marcus Hayes's wife, running from a man who beat her, carrying 3 children through a Montana winter with nothing but desperation and hope. Dan made his decision in that moment. He would not ask about the money, would not question why she was here, would only do what Elizabeth would have wanted him to do, what his father's journal had taught him to do. Protect the weak, keep your word, build something that matters. "We'll wait here until the worst passes," Dan said. "Then we move fast for the cabin." "Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Dan looked at Tommy, at Lily, at little Grace. Saw Jacob in all their faces. Saw Elizabeth's gentle determination in Sarah's eyes. "Because I made a promise once, to someone who mattered, and I mean to keep it." They huddled in the ravine for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. The storm raged above them, but in their small shelter wrapped in wool and pressed together for warmth, they survived. Finally, the wind began to ease. The snow still fell, but the murderous intensity had passed. Dan stood, his joints stiff with cold, and helped Sarah to her feet. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though he could see she was barely holding on. Dan lifted the girls back onto Smoke, then helped Sarah up behind them. Tommy was standing now, the oversized gloves still on his hands, his face set with determination. "Ready?" "Yes, sir." They climbed out of the ravine and back onto the trail. The landscape was transformed, familiar landmarks buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. But Dan knew this country, had ridden these trails for 8 years. He could navigate by the shape of the hills, the pattern of the trees. Smoke plodded forward steadily, his big hooves breaking through the snow. Dan walked alongside, one hand on the bridle, the other holding Tommy's shoulder to keep the boy upright. The cabin came into view slowly, like a ship emerging from fog. First the dark shape of the roof, then the solid stone walls, finally the glow of lamplight in the windows. Dan always left a lamp burning, a beacon for himself when he returned after dark. "There," he said, pointing. "Home." Sarah made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Tommy stumbled forward, drawn by the promise of warmth. Dan led them to the cabin door and pushed it open. Heat rolled out, blessed and overwhelming. He helped Sarah down, caught her when her legs nearly gave way, and guided her inside. The children followed Tommy, practically carrying Grace. They stood in the main room, dripping snow on the floor, staring at the space with wide eyes. Dan quickly stoked the fire, adding logs until flames roared high. He filled the kettle with water and set it to boil. Then he pulled out blankets, wool and thick, and draped them around each shivering body. "Sit by the fire. All of you. Don't move until you stop shaking." They obeyed without question, too cold and exhausted to argue. Dan moved around the cabin, lighting more lamps, closing shutters against the storm, preparing soup from dried venison and vegetables he kept in the cellar. As he worked, he studied them in the firelight. Sarah was younger than he had thought, maybe Elizabeth's age when she died. Pretty despite the exhaustion and fear. Tommy had her eyes dark and intelligent. Lily had her mother's delicate features. Grace had blonde hair lighter than the others and a rosebud mouth. They were not his family. But standing there watching them huddle together by his fire, Dan felt something shift in his chest. Something he thought had died with Elizabeth and Jacob. Purpose. The soup heated slowly, filling the cabin with the smell of herbs and meat. Dan ladled it into wooden bowls, handed one to each person. They ate without speaking, too hungry for words. When they finished, Grace's eyes were drooping, Sarah held her close, fighting her own exhaustion. The bedroom, Dan said, pointing to the door on the left. Take it, there's a bed, clean sheets, plenty of blankets. Where will you sleep? Out here, by the fire. I've slept in worse places. Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She gathered her daughters and followed Dan into the bedroom. It was the room he had shared with Elizabeth, the bed they had made Jacob in. He had not entered it in 3 years sleeping, instead on the couch in the main room. But tonight, Sarah and her children needed it more than he needed to avoid ghosts. He showed her the wash basin, the extra blankets in the chest, the chamber pot behind the screen. Then he left them alone, closing the door softly. Tommy remained by the fire, still wearing Dan's gloves. The boy was watching him with careful eyes, trying to understand this stranger who had saved them. Dan sat down in his father's old chair, the leather cracked and worn. You can sleep on the couch. It's more comfortable than it looks. Where are you going to sleep? Floor. I've done it before. Tommy frowned. That's not right. It's your house. And you're my guest. Dan leaned forward, meeting the boy's eyes. Tommy, I know you don't trust me. I know you're trying to figure out if I'm going to hurt you or your mother or your sisters. That's smart. That's what a man does when he's responsible for his family. Tommy's expression didn't change, but Dan saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition. Respect. Are you going to hurt us? No, I promise you that. Why should I believe you? Because I kept you alive in the storm. Because I gave you my gloves. Because I gave you my bed. Dan paused. And because I lost my own family to the cold 3 years ago. I won't let it happen to someone else. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he pulled off Dan's gloves and handed them back. Thank you for saving us. Dan took the gloves, his throat tight. You're welcome. He showed Tommy where to find extra blankets, how to bank the fire so it would burn through the night. The boy was quick, absorbing the information with the intensity of someone who knew survival depended on learning fast. When Tommy was settled on the couch, Dan took his own blanket and spread it on the floor near the fire. The stone was hard beneath him, but he had slept on worse. In South Dakota, he had sometimes slept in the saddle, riding through the night, hunting men who hunted others. But that was a different life, a different Daniel Morgan. He closed his eyes and listened to the storm battering the cabin walls. Inside, they were warm and safe. Outside, the world was trying to kill them, but they had survived. In the bedroom, Sarah lay awake long after her daughters fell asleep. She could hear the quiet sounds of the main room, the crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of the boy Tommy, and underneath it all, the presence of the man who had saved them. Daniel Morgan, a stranger who had stepped in when no one else would, who had given them food and shelter without asking for anything in return, who had looked at her children with something like pain in his eyes. Sarah had learned not to trust men. 10 years with Marcus had taught her that kindness was a mask men wore until they got what they wanted. That strength was used to control, not protect. That promises meant nothing when anger took over. But Daniel Morgan was different. She had seen it in the way he handled the children. Gentle but not weak, strong but not cruel. He had knelt in the snow to speak to Tommy at eye level, had wrapped his own coat around Lily and Grace, had given Sarah his bedroom without hesitation. Who was this man? This quiet rancher who lived alone in the mountains? What had he lost 3 years ago that made him look at her children with such profound sadness? Sarah didn't know. But lying there in his bed, warm and safe for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't felt since she was a girl. Hope. Morning came soft and gray. Dan woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment, still half asleep, he thought Elizabeth was cooking breakfast. Then memory returned, sharp and cold. He sat up, his back protesting the hard floor. Tommy was already awake, sitting at the table with the book open in front of him. The boy looked up as Dan rose. Your mother let me read this. I hope that's okay. Dan walked over, curious. It was one of his father's farming journals filled with notes on crop rotation and animal husbandry. Not exactly light reading for a 9-year-old. Can you read? Yes, sir. Mama taught me. Taught my sisters too, though Grace is still learning. Dan poured himself coffee, impressed. Not many children on the frontier had that advantage. Your mother is a teacher. Was, before she married Marcus Hayes. The name hung in the air between them. Dan had known, of course, had guessed the night before, but hearing it confirmed was different. He's your father. No, Tommy's voice was flat final. A father protects his family. Marcus Hayes only knows how to hurt them. Dan sat down across from the boy, cradling his coffee cup. How long has he been hurting your mother? Since I can remember. But it got worse after Grace was born. He drinks. When he drinks, he gets angry. When he's angry, he... Tommy's voice trailed off, but Dan didn't need him to finish. He had seen the bruises on Sarah's wrists, could imagine what other marks lay hidden beneath her clothes. You tried to stop him. It wasn't a question. Dan knew. Had recognized the signs the moment he saw Tommy step between his mother and Fletcher. A boy who had learned too young that he had to be a man. I tried, but I'm not strong enough. Tommy's hands clenched on the table. Not yet. The bedroom door opened. Sarah emerged, Lily and Grace behind her. She had washed her face and combed her hair, and in the morning light, Dan could see the woman she must have been before Marcus Hayes broke her. I made breakfast. I hope you don't mind. It seemed I wanted to do something. To thank you. You didn't need to. I did. Sarah met his eyes. You saved our lives. Breakfast is small payment. They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but contemplative. Dan watched the way Sarah cut Lily's bacon into small pieces, the way Tommy made sure Grace got the softest portion of bread, the way they moved around each other with practiced efficiency, a family unit that had learned to function despite the dysfunction of the man who should have led them. After breakfast, Dan showed them around the cabin properly, the main room with its large fireplace and handmade furniture, the small library his mother had started, books collected over decades, the bedroom Sarah had slept in, and then hesitantly another door at the back of the cabin. Dan hadn't opened it in 3 years, but Lily was curious, pushing past him before he could stop her. What's in here? The room was small, barely more than a large closet, but every inch was filled with memories. A child-sized bed, wooden toys carved by Dan's own hands, a rocking horse his father had made, clothes hanging from pegs small and never worn again. Jacob's room, preserved exactly as it had been the day he died. Lily walked in slowly, drawn by the toys. She picked up a wooden soldier, examining it with careful fingers. Dan felt his chest tighten. He should tell her to put it down, should close the door and lock away these memories. But watching Lily hold the toy so carefully, her face full of wonder, he found he couldn't. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression stricken. Lily, put that down. That's not yours. It's all right, Dan heard himself say. She can play with them. They were meant to be played with. Sarah looked at him, understanding dawning. This was your son's room. Yes. I'm sorry, we shouldn't have intruded. You didn't. I haven't opened this door in 3 years. Maybe it's time. Lily sat on the floor, the wooden soldier still in her hands. Grace joined her, picking up a stuffed bear with button eyes. They played quietly, respectfully, sensing the weight of the room's history. Dan turned away, unable to watch anymore. Sarah followed him back to the main room. I didn't know, she said softly, about your family. Elizabeth and Jacob. 3 years ago, this December. A storm worse than yesterday's. I was in town getting medicine. Elizabeth was sick. I thought I had time, but the storm came faster than anyone predicted. Dan stared into the fire. When I got back, they were in the barn. Elizabeth had tried to get to shelter with Jacob, but the cold, it was too much. I'm so sorry. I made a promise that day, standing over their graves, that I would never let the cold take someone I could save. That's why I helped you. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, we're not your responsibility. Maybe not, but you needed help, and I could give it. Dan turned to face her. How long have you been running? Sarah's face went still. What do you know? That Marcus Hayes is a sheriff in Wyoming, that he's accused of theft, that you disappeared the same night with your children. Dan kept his voice level, non-judgmental. And that you're carrying something he wants back badly enough to follow you across 2 territories. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the small bag at her waist. The motion was tiny, almost imperceptible. But Dan saw it. I didn't steal it, she said. Not at first. I thought it was our savings. Money I had been setting aside for years, hoping to leave him. But when I counted it, $500. Far more than I could have saved. And then I heard him talking to a man about a robbery, about money they had taken from the county office. So you took it and ran. I was going to leave it behind, but then I realized, if Marcus reports me, if he says I stole it, I'll hang. But if I keep it, I have leverage. Proof he's a criminal too. It was smart. Dangerous but smart. Marcus couldn't report the theft without incriminating himself. Does he know you have it? He must. It's the only thing that explains. Sarah's voice cracked. He'll come after us. He'll find us. And when he does, he'll have to go through me first. Sarah looked at him, searching his face. Why you don't know us? We're nothing to you. You're three children who need protection. A mother trying to keep them safe. That's enough. Tommy appeared in the doorway, his expression serious. Sir, can I ask you something? Daniel, call me Dan. Dan, then. Tommy took a breath. Are you afraid of Marcus Hayes? Dan considered the question. Thought about the 12 men in Deadwood, about the things he had done as the Montana Ghost, about the violence he was capable of even now. No. Good. Tommy's face was fierce, determined, because I want to learn to fight, to protect my family. Will you teach me? Dan looked at Sarah, saw the conflict in her eyes. She wanted Tommy to stay innocent, but she also knew the world didn't allow that luxury. I'll teach you, Dan said, but not to fight, to survive, to be strong, to protect without becoming what you hate. He held Tommy's gaze. Can you do that? Yes, sir. I mean, yes, Dan. The rest of the day passed in a strange domesticity. Dan showed Tommy how to split wood, how to check the animals in the barn, how to read the sky for weather. Sarah cooked lunch, refusing to let Dan do all the work. Lily and Grace played with Jacob's toys, their laughter filling the cabin with sounds it hadn't heard in 3 years. Evening came early, the winter sun setting before 5 o'clock. They gathered around the fire, Dan in his father's chair, Sarah and the children on the couch. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried in fresh snow. Dana opened his father's journal, found a page he remembered, and began to read aloud. December 1870. Taught Daniel how to use an axe today. He's only 12, still growing into his strength, but he has determination. That matters more than muscle. A man builds his legacy not with what he takes, but with what he gives. Land, knowledge, honor. These are the things that last. He looked up to find them all watching him. Even Grace, who hadn't spoken since they arrived. Your father wrote that? Tommy asked. Yes. He kept journals his whole life. Advice, instructions, stories. He wanted to leave something behind for me, for my children after me. Dan closed the book carefully. This ranch has been in my family for 37 years. My grandfather claimed it when Montana was still wild. My father built this cabin with his own hands, and now it's mine to keep. It must be important to you, Sarah said. It's everything. Dan looked around the cabin at the life his family had built. It's not just land, it's legacy. It's proof that we mattered, that we built something that will last. Tommy leaned forward. What will you pass it to if you don't have, if I don't have a son, Dan finished gently. I don't know. Maybe it dies with me. Or maybe, he looked at Tommy at the fierce intelligence in the boy's eyes. Maybe legacy isn't always blood. Maybe it's teaching someone else what you know, passing on what matters. Sarah's hand found her son's shoulder, pulling him close. They sat in comfortable silence until Grace yawned, huge and uncontrollable. Sarah laughed, the sound soft and surprised, as if she had forgotten what laughter felt like. Bedtime for you two, she said, gathering her daughters. But Mama, Lily protested, it's not even dark yet. The sun sets early in winter, and you need your rest. Dan stood. I should check the barn, make sure the animals survive the storm. I'll come with you, Tommy said immediately. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Don't be long. Outside, the world was transformed. Snow glittered in the moonlight, pristine and beautiful. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. Dan and Tommy walked to the barn, their boots crunching in the snow. Inside, the animals were safe. Dan's 2 cows, his horse Smoke, and a handful of chickens that provided eggs. Tommy helped him distribute feed, learning the routine quickly. As they worked, the boy kept glancing at Dan, building up courage to ask something. What is it? Dan finally said. In the store when you helped us. People were afraid of you. Why? Dan paused, a scoop of grain in his hands. He could lie, could tell the boy he imagined it, but Tommy deserved the truth. Because I used to be someone else, someone dangerous. Before I married Elizabeth, before I became a rancher, I wore a badge. Deputy Marshal. I hunted men. Bad men. Yes, killers, thieves, men who hurt people. Dan set down the grain scoop, and I was good at it. Very good. Too good. I earned a reputation, a name people remembered. The Montana Ghost. Tommy's eyes widened. I've heard that name. Marcus used to tell us stories. Said the ghost killed 12 men in one night in Deadwood. Said no one ever saw him coming. The stories are true. How many men did you kill? Dan had known the question would come. 12 in Deadwood, 7 others before that, 19 total. Did they all deserve it? I thought so at the time. Now, Dan met Tommy's eyes. Now, I'm not sure anyone deserves death, but they were killing innocent people, and someone had to stop them. Tommy considered this. Do you regret it? Every day, not because they didn't need stopping, but because taking a life changes you, makes you harder, colder. I was becoming something I didn't recognize. That's why I quit, why I came here, why I buried my guns and married Elizabeth. Dan's voice went soft. She saved me, showed me I could be something other than the ghost. And now I'm just Daniel Morgan, a rancher, a widower, a man trying to keep a promise to the woman he loved. They finished with the animals and walked back to the cabin. At the door, Tommy stopped. Dan, if Marcus comes, will you become the ghost again? Dan thought about the question, about the line between protecting and killing, about how easy it was to cross and how hard to come back. I hope I don't have to, but if it means keeping you and your family safe. He met Tommy's eyes. Yes. Tommy nodded, satisfied. They went inside. Sarah had put the girls to bed and was sitting by the fire mending a tear in Lily's dress. She looked up as they entered, her eyes going to Tommy, checking that he was all right. We fed the animals, Tommy reported. Dan showed me how. That's good. Sarah's eyes moved to Dan, full of questions, but she didn't ask them. Not in front of Tommy. Bed, she told her son. Tomorrow will be another long day. Tommy obeyed without argument, settling on the couch with the blankets Dan provided. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep. Sarah set aside her mending. What did you tell him? The truth about who I was, what I did. And now he knows you're a killer. Yes. Dan didn't flinch from the word. He asked, I don't lie to children. They deserve better. Sarah stood walking to the window. Outside, snow fell again, gentle now, covering the world in fresh white. Marcus is coming. You know that, don't you? Yes. And when he does, there will be blood. Maybe, but not yours, not your children's. Sarah turned to face him. Why are you doing this, really? Dan looked at the photograph on the mantel. Elizabeth and Jacob smiling at a camera, unaware that they had less than a year left together. Because I was too late to save them. Because I made a promise. Because... He struggled for words. Because your son looks at you the way Jacob looked at Elizabeth. Protective, loving, determined. And your girls need a chance to be children, not victims. And you deserve to live without fear. I'm nobody. We're nobody. You're somebody to Tommy, to Lily and Grace. That makes you somebody to me. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. If we stay, we put you in danger. I've been in danger before. This is different. Marcus is law. He has authority. He can bring other men, make this legal. Then we'll fight it legally. And if that doesn't work, Dan met her eyes, then I'll do what needs to be done. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. Finally, Sarah spoke. Thank you for everything, for saving us, for giving us shelter, for being kind when no one else would. You don't need to thank me. I do, because men like you, men who help without expecting anything, they're rare. She went to bed then, leaving Dan alone with his thoughts and the ghost that never quite left him. He sat in his father's chair, staring into the fire, and thought about the choice he had made. Taking in Sarah and her children meant trouble. Marcus Hayes would come. There would be conflict, possibly violence. The quiet life Dan had built, the peace he had found, would shatter. But sitting there listening to the soft breathing of children, sleeping safe and warm in his home, Dan found he didn't regret it. Sometimes a man had to choose between safety and right, between peace and protection, between who he wanted to be and who he needed to be. Dan chose protection, chose right, chose to be the man his father's journal described the man Elizabeth had believed in. He reached for the wooden box on the mantel, opened it. The Colt Peacemaker lay inside its surface dull with disuse. Dan lifted it, felt its familiar weight. The chambers were still empty. He had sworn never to load it again. But promises he was learning were sometimes made to be broken, especially when keeping one promise meant breaking another. Dan set the gun back in its box, but left the lid open, just in case. Outside, the storm built again, wind howling down from the mountains. But inside the cabin, 5 people slept warm and safe, protected by stone walls built to last. And a man who had decided that legacy wasn't just about what you built, but about who you saved. The next morning would bring new challenges. Marcus Hayes was out there somewhere hunting his wife and children. The land dispute threatened to take half of Dan's ranch. Winter had barely begun and already it had tested them. But tonight, this moment, they had survived. And sometimes survival was victory enough. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Dan woke before dawn, tended the animals, split wood for the fire. Sarah cooked meals that filled the cabin with warmth and the smell of herbs. Tommy learned to mend fences, to read the weather, to handle an axe with increasing confidence. Lily and Grace played with Jacob's toys, their laughter a sound the cabin walls had forgotten. But beneath the routine, tension grew like ice forming on a river. Dan felt it in his bones the way old wounds ached before a storm. Marcus Hayes was coming. It was not a question of if, but when. On the 4th morning, Sheriff Barrett arrived as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. Dan saw him coming from half a mile away, his horse moving fast, urgency in every stride. Dan met him at the door, already knowing it was bad news. "He's here," Barrett said without preamble. "Rode into Coldwater last night with 2 men, wearing his badge like it gives him authority in Montana." "It doesn't. Try telling him that." Barrett dismounted, his face grim. "He's got paperwork, Dan. Marriage certificate, birth certificates for all 3 children with his name as father. Even has a court order from Wyoming giving him custody." Dan felt cold settle in his stomach. "The papers are legitimate. Look legitimate. Whether they're real or forged, I can't tell without sending telegrams, and that takes time." "How much time?" "Week, maybe more." "We don't have a week." Barrett tied his horse and followed Dan into the cabin. Inside, Sarah was kneading bread dough, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She looked up as they entered, saw their faces, and went pale. "He's here." It wasn't a question. "In Coldwater," Barrett confirmed. "Asking about you, about the children. Claims you're unstable, that you kidnapped his kids and stole money from the family savings." "That's a lie." "I know, but he's got papers to back up his story. And I'm just a county sheriff. He's a town marshal with jurisdiction in Wyoming. Technically, he outranks me." Sarah's hands stilled in the dough flour, dusting her fingers like snow. "What do we do?" Dan looked at Barrett, then at Sarah. An idea was forming, dangerous and desperate, but it might work. "We get married." Silence filled the cabin. Sarah stared at him, incomprehension giving way to shock. "What?" "Montana law. A woman's custody rights transfer to her husband. If you're married to me, Marcus loses his legal claim. The children become my responsibility." "That's," Sarah shook her head, "that's insane." "It's the law," Barrett said slowly, catching on. "Passed in '89. Designed to protect women in second marriages. If Sarah is legally married to Dan, Marcus's papers don't mean anything." "It would be a marriage in name only," Dan added quickly, seeing the fear in Sarah's eyes. "On paper. Legal. But you wouldn't owe me anything. When this is over, when Marcus is gone, we can dissolve it. You'd be free." Sarah looked down at her hands, at the dough beneath her fingers. Tommy had emerged from the boy room listening. His face was tight with understanding beyond his years. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "Marcus filed a complaint this morning," Barrett said. "Gave me 48 hours to bring you in for questioning. If I don't, he says he'll come get you himself." 48 hours. Dan met Sarah's eyes. "We can be married in one. Barrett can perform the ceremony. It's legal, binding, and it protects you." "Why would you do this?" Sarah's voice cracked. "You barely know us." "I know enough. I know Marcus Hayes beat you. I know he's using the law as a weapon. I know your children deserve better." Dan paused. And I know what my father would say. Protect the weak. Keep your word. Do what's right even when it's hard. Tommy stepped forward. Mama, I think we should. Sarah looked at her son, saw the determination in his young face. Then she looked at Dan, searching for deception, for ulterior motive, for the trap she had learned to expect from men. She found none of it, only steady resolve and quiet honor. All right, she whispered. We'll do it. Barrett nodded. I'll ride to town, get the license. Bring Pastor Miller. We can do this before sundown. And Marcus, I'll tell him you're cooperating, that you'll come in tomorrow for questioning. It'll buy us time. The sheriff left at a gallop. Dan turned to Sarah, saw her trembling. You can still change your mind. No, Sarah straightened, found her strength. No, you're right. It's the only way to protect my children. I'll do whatever it takes. The rest of the day passed in a strange limbo. Sarah finished her bread, the routine calming her nerves. Dan taught Tommy how to check the animals for signs of illness, simple lessons that felt profound given what was coming. Lillian and Grace sensed the tension, played quietly, asked no questions. Barrett returned at 3 in the afternoon, Pastor Miller riding beside him. The old minister was a fixture in Coldwater, had married half the couples in the county, buried the other half when their time came. He had performed Elizabeth and Dan's wedding 8 years ago. Daniel, Miller's voice was gentle. Tom tells me you're taking a wife. Yes, sir. Unusual circumstances. Yes, sir. Miller studied Dan's face, then nodded. Elizabeth would approve, I think. She always said you had a good heart. Too often hidden, but good. They gathered in the main room, the fire crackling, winter light streaming through the windows. Sarah wore the same dress she had arrived in, faded but clean. Dan had no suit, only his work clothes, but he had washed and shaved, made himself presentable. Tommy stood beside his mother, Lily and Grace on either side. Barrett served as witness, his face solemn. Pastor Miller opened his worn Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words washed over Dan, familiar and strange. He had said them before, it meant them with all his heart. Now he was saying them again for different reasons with a woman he barely knew. But as he looked at Sarah, saw the fear and hope warring in her eyes, he made a decision. This might be a marriage of convenience, of legal necessity, but he would honor it as if it were real, would protect her as if she were truly his wife, would care for her children as if they were truly his. Daniel Morgan, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Sarah Hayes, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Sarah's voice was barely audible. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. Dan slipped a ring onto Sarah's finger. It was Elizabeth's ring, simple gold, worn smooth. He had kept it in a box, unable to part with it. Now it found a new purpose. Sarah stared at the ring, tears sliding down her cheeks. It was my wife's, Dan said quietly. She would want you to have it. Pastor Miller closed his Bible. What God has joined, let no man put asunder. They signed the certificate. Barrett and Miller witnessed. It was done. Legal. Binding. Sarah Hayes was now Sarah Morgan. After Miller left promising discretion, the 5 of them stood awkwardly in the cabin. Married but not married. A family but not a family. Tommy broke the silence. Does this mean Dan is our father now? Sarah looked at Dan, uncertain. On paper, Dan said carefully. Legally. But that's between you and me, Tommy. Family isn't something you can sign on a certificate. It's something you earn. Then earn it, Tommy said, his voice fierce. Prove you're not like Marcus. Prove you're the man we need. I will. That night after the children slept, Dan and Sarah sat by the fire. Husband and wife in name. Strangers in truth. I don't know how to do this, Sarah admitted. How to be married to someone to someone who isn't. We don't have to do anything, Dan said. This is legal protection. Nothing more. You sleep in the bedroom. I sleep out here. We live as we have been. When this is over, we end it. Just like that. Just like that. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. You loved her very much, your wife. Yes. Do you still every day? Dan looked at the photograph on the mantel. But she's gone. And I'm still here. And there are people who need help. Elizabeth would understand. She would want this. How can you be sure? Because she was like you, strong, protective, willing to do anything for those she loved. Dan met Sarah's eyes. She would have liked you. Sarah smiled small and sad. I wish I could have known her. Maybe you did, in another life. They sat in companionable silence until Sarah rose to go to bed. At the door, she paused. Thank you for this, for protecting us. You're my wife now. On paper or not, that means something to me. Sarah nodded and disappeared into the bedroom. Dan remained by the fire, the ring on his own finger feeling foreign and familiar at once. Outside in the darkness beyond the cabin, a horse stood hidden in the trees. Marcus Hayes sat in the saddle watching lamplight flicker in the windows. He had followed Barrett from town, careful to stay back, to remain unseen. Now he knew where they were, knew that Sarah had found shelter with some mountain hermit, knew that he would have to take them by force. Marcus smiled cold and cruel. Let them have their moment of false security. Let them think they were safe. Tomorrow he would show them what happened to people who defied him. He turned his horse and rode back toward Coldwater, already planning. Morning came too soon. Dan woke to find Tommy already up, standing at the window watching the eastern horizon. Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about Marcus, about what he'll do when he finds out. Dan joined the boy at the window. He already knows, or will soon. Barrett had to file the marriage certificate, public record. Marcus will see it. And then he'll be angry. Desperate men do desperate things. Tommy turned to look at Dan. Are you scared? Yes. The honesty seemed to surprise the boy. But you're the Montana ghost. You killed 12 men in one night. Being scared doesn't mean you're weak, Tommy. It means you have something to lose, something worth protecting. Dan put a hand on the boy's shoulder. I'm scared because I don't want to fail you. Don't want to let Marcus hurt your family. That fear makes me careful, makes me prepared. Will you teach me to be prepared? Yes, starting now. They went outside into the pre-dawn cold. The world was blue and silver stars still visible in the western sky. Dan led Tommy to the barn, showed him the rifle he kept there, a Winchester repeater well-maintained and deadly accurate. First rule of defending yourself. Know your weapons. This rifle holds 15 rounds. Effective range 400 yards. Reloads fast. Dan demonstrated working the lever action. But a gun is only as good as the person holding it. You have to be calm, focused, breathing steady. He taught Tommy how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to compensate for wind and distance. The boy was a quick learner, his hands steady despite his youth. Why are you teaching me this? Tommy asked as they practiced with empty chambers. Thought you said guns were the last resort. They are, but last resort doesn't mean unprepared. If Marcus comes here with violence, you need to know how to protect your mother and sisters. Not because I won't be here, but because I might not be enough. Tommy absorbed this, his face serious. You think he'll bring help? I know he will. A man like Marcus doesn't fight fair. He'll bring deputies, maybe hired guns. He'll use his badge as authority. Dan met the boy's eyes. And if that happens, if things go wrong, I need you to get your family to safety. Can you do that? Where would we go? There's a cave half-mile north of here, past the ridge down into the valley. Hidden entrance behind a fallen pine. Take them there. Wait 3 days. If I don't come, take the horses and ride to Billings. Find the federal marshal. Tell him everything. I don't want to run. Running isn't cowardice when you are protecting others. It's wisdom. Dan handed Tommy the rifle. But I don't think it'll come to that. Barrett is working on something. A legal solution. They returned to the cabin to find Sarah making breakfast, her movements efficient despite the tension in her shoulders. Lily and Grace were still asleep, 2 small lumps beneath blankets in the bedroom. Where were you? Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Teaching Tommy, Dan said simply. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She understood necessity even when she hated it. They ate in silence, each lost in thought. The knock came as they were finishing 3 sharp raps that made everyone jump. Dan was at the door before Sarah could move rifle in hand, but it was only Barrett, his face grave. We have a problem. Inside, Barrett removed his hat, accepted coffee, took a breath before speaking. Marcus went to the territorial judge in Helena, filed an injunction, claims the marriage is fraudulent, done specifically to circumvent his custody rights. Can he do that? Sarah asked. He did. Judge issued an order. You and Dan have to appear in court. 7 days. Prove the marriage is legitimate. Or what? Or it gets annulled. Marcus gets custody, and Barrett hesitated. There's a warrant for you, Sarah. Theft. $500. Marcus claims you stole it from family savings. Sarah went white. That's his money, stolen money, from the robbery. Can you prove it? No, it was in a box in our house. No bank records, no receipt, just cash. Dan set down his coffee cup carefully. So Marcus wins either way. If we don't go to court, the marriage is void. If we do go, he arrests Sarah for theft. That's about the size of it. Unless we can prove Marcus is lying, prove the money was never his to begin with. Barrett nodded slowly. I sent telegrams to Wyoming, asked for records, anything that might connect Marcus to theft or corruption. But it takes time. How much time? Week, maybe 2. We don't have 2 weeks, we have 7 days. The room fell silent. Tommy stood his young face hard with determination. Then we go to Wyoming, find the proof ourselves. Everyone turned to look at him. I can't leave Sarah and the girls here alone, Dan said. I'll stay, Barrett offered. Camp here. Make sure Marcus doesn't try anything while you're gone. It's too dangerous, Sarah protested. Marcus will know. He'll be waiting. Tommy stepped forward. Then I go with Dan. 2 sets of eyes, 2 guns, better odds. Absolutely not. Mama, I have to. This is our fight too. Our family. I'm not a child anymore. Sarah looked at her son, saw the man he was becoming, saw that arguing would only hurt him. She turned to Dan, her eyes pleading, keep him safe. With my life. They left at first light the next morning, Dan and Tommy on horseback supplies, packed for a 3-day journey. The ride to Wyoming would take 36 hours hard travel. They would have maybe 12 hours to find evidence before they had to turn back to make it to court on time. It was tight, dangerous, but it was the only chance they had. Sarah stood in the cabin doorway watching them ride away. Lily and Grace pressed against her sides. Barrett stood nearby, rifle cradled in his arms, eyes scanning the tree line. They'll be all right, I'll tell ya, he said more to himself than to Sarah. Will they? Sarah watched until Dan and Tommy disappeared into the forest. Or am I sending my son to his death? Dan Morgan is one of the most dangerous men I've ever known, not because he's violent, because he's smart, prepared. He won't let anything happen to Tommy. You're sure? As sure as I can be about anything. Sarah turned back into the cabin, pulling her daughters close. All she could do now was wait and pray that Dan kept his promise. The journey south was hard and cold. Dan and Tommy rode through frozen forests and over mountain passes, the landscape brutal in its winter severity. They stopped only to rest. The horses ate jerky, and hardtack in the saddles spoke little. On the second day, as they crossed into Wyoming territory, Tommy finally broke the silence. Why did you really agree to marry Mama? Dan considered the question, chose honesty. Because I saw my son in you, saw my wife in your mother, and because I failed them, failed to be there when they needed me most. This is my chance to not fail again. You couldn't have known the storm would come. Doesn't matter, I wasn't there. That's what I live with. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Do you think about them every day? Every moment? Does it get easier? No, you just get stronger at carrying it. They rode on. The town of Casper appeared at sunset on the second day, a cluster of buildings huddled against the wind. Dan led them to a saloon on the edge of town, the kind of place where strangers could drink and ask questions without drawing attention. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Men hunched over tables, nursing whiskey, speaking in low voices. Dan ordered 2 meals coffee for Tommy, whiskey for himself. While they ate, Dan listened, picked up fragments of conversation. The name Marcus Hayes came up more than once, always spoken with a mixture of fear and contempt. Heard Hayes got run out, one man said to his companion. Something about missing money, county fund. Good riddance. Man was a brute. Arrested my cousin for drunk and disorderly, beat him so bad he lost an eye. Anyone report him? To who he was the law. Dan caught the bartender's eye, gestured him over. I'm looking for information about Marcus Hayes. Used to be sheriff here. The bartender's face closed. Don't know nothing about that. Dan slid a silver dollar across the bar. I'm not a friend of Hayes, quite the opposite. The bartender took the coin, looked around to make sure no one was listening. Hayes was corrupt. Everyone knew it. Took bribes, looked the other way for the right price. But no one could touch him. Not until the money went missing. $500. From the county safe. Hayes claimed someone broke in, but the lock wasn't forced. Safe wasn't damaged. Only 3 people had keys. The judge, the mayor, and Hayes. What happened? Investigation started. Hayes got nervous. Then his wife disappeared with the kids. Next day, Hayes says she stole the money and ran. But nobody believed it. Sarah Hayes was a school teacher. Good woman, quiet. We all knew what Hayes did to her. Anyone willing to testify to that? The bartender hesitated. There's a doctor in town, Henry Miller. Used to treat Sarah when Hayes got rough. He might talk to you, but be careful. Hayes still has friends here. Men he paid, men who owe him. Dan finished his drink and left money for the meal. Outside, night had fallen, the streets dark except for lamplight spilling from windows. Where are we going, as Tommy asked. To find Dr. Miller. They found the doctor's office 2 streets over a small clapboard building with a painted sign. Light showed in the upper window. Dan knocked, waited. A man in his 60s answered, spectacles perched on his nose, suspicion in his eyes. We're closed. Dr. Miller. My name is Daniel Morgan. This is Tommy Hayes. We need to talk about Sarah Hayes and her husband Marcus. Miller's expression changed at the name. Come in, quickly. Inside the office smelled of carbolic and old paper. Miller led them upstairs to his private quarters, a simple room with a desk and chairs. Sarah, Miller said, sitting heavily. Is she alive? Yes, safe with me in Montana. Relief washed over the doctor's face. Thank God. When she disappeared, I feared the worst. Marcus was capable of anything. That's why we're here. We need evidence. Proof that Marcus was abusing Sarah. That the money he claims she stole wasn't family savings, but stolen from the county fund. Miller removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief. I have evidence, medical records. Every time Sarah came to me, I documented her injuries. Bruises, broken ribs, once a fractured jaw. I asked her to report him. She said it would only make things worse. Will you testify in court? Against Marcus. Miller put his glasses back on. He'll destroy me, ruin my practice. He's already being investigated for theft. His authority is hanging by a thread. And if you don't help, Sarah might lose her children. Tommy and his sisters might be forced back to a man who beat their mother. Miller looked at Tommy, saw the desperation in the boy's face. All right, I'll testify. I'll bring my records. When is the hearing? 5 days. In Helena. I'll be there. They left Miller's office with hope kindling in their chests. But as they stepped into the street, Dan felt the hairs on his neck rise. Years of hunting men had taught him to recognize danger. Tommy, walk casual. Don't look around. There are men watching us. Where? Alley across the street. 2, maybe 3 more at the end of the block. What do? We head for the horses, fast but not running. If shooting starts, you drop and find cover. Understand? Yes. They moved toward the stable where they had left their horses. Dan's hand rested on the pistol at his hip, thumb on the hammer. The men in the alley shifted, following. They were 20 feet from the stable when a voice called out, Morgan, that's far enough. Dan turned slowly. 3 men stood in the street, spread out hands near their weapons. The one in the middle wore a deputy's badge. All 3 had the look of hired gunsmen who killed for money. We don't want trouble, Dan said evenly. Then you shouldn't have come to Casper. Marcus Hayes sends his regards. Hayes know you're here. Doesn't need to. He pays us to keep his interests safe. You're threatening those interests. Dan moved slightly, positioning himself between the men and Tommy. The boy's not part of this. Let him go. Can't do that. Both of you come with us. Nice and easy. Or, the deputy smiled. Or we drag your bodies to the undertaker. Your choice. Dan's mind raced, calculating angles and distances. 3 men facing him, maybe more in the shadows. Tommy behind him, brave but inexperienced. Odds were bad, but he had faced worse in Deadwood. 12 men in one night. These 3 were nothing compared to that. But he had been younger then, faster, and he hadn't had a boy to protect. Tommy, Dan said quietly, when I move, you run for the stable. Get on your horse and ride. Don't stop. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. Yes, you are. That's an order. The deputy's smile widened. Ain't that sweet? The old gunfighter trying to save the kid. Problem is you're too slow now, Morgan. Too old, though. The Montana ghost is dead. You're just a rancher pretending to be dangerous. Dan met the man's eyes, let him see what lay beneath the quiet exterior. Let him see the 12 bodies in Deadwood. The 7 before that. The man who had earned a reputation written in blood and fear. You're making a mistake. Don't think so. The deputy went for his gun. Dan moved. His hand was a blur, the Colt clearing leather faster than thought. He fired 3 times in 2 seconds. The deputy went down, blood blooming on his chest. The man to his left spun away, shoulder shattered. The third started to run, but Dan's 4th shot took him in the leg, dropping him screaming. The entire fight lasted less than 5 seconds. Dan turned, gun still raised, scanning for more threats. The street was empty except for the fallen men and Tommy, who stood frozen, eyes wide with shock. Are they dead? 2 wounded, 1 dead. Dan moved quickly, checking the bodies, kicking away weapons. We need to leave, now. They ran for the stable, mounted their horses, and rode hard out of Casper. Behind them, shouts rose, alarm spreading. But they were already gone, disappearing into the night. Tommy rode beside Dan, his face pale, hands shaking. You shot them. You moved so fast. I'm sorry you had to see that. Don't be. Tommy's voice was fierce. You saved us, saved me, just like you promised. They rode through the night, putting distance between themselves and Casper. When dawn came, they were 20 miles north, following a game trail through the mountains. Dan called a halt, let the horses rest and drink from a stream. Tommy dismounted, his legs almost giving way. Dan caught him, steadied him. First time seeing someone shot? Yes. It's not like stories, not clean or heroic. Is that what being the Montana ghost was like? Killing. Every time. And every time it took thing from me. Dan met Tommy's eyes. That's why I stopped. Why I came to Montana. I didn't want to be that man anymore. But you saved us. I did what I had to. Doesn't mean I'm proud of it. Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing. Then the man you shot, the one who died, he had a choice. He could have let us go. He chose to fight. Yes. Then his death is on him, not you. Dan felt something loosen in his chest. This boy, 9 years old, somehow understood what it had taken Dan years to accept. That violence in defense was not the same as violence for its own sake. That protecting others sometimes required terrible choices. They mounted again, rode on. Behind them, pursuit would come. Marcus's men would not let this go. But they had the evidence they needed. Miller would testify. They could prove Sarah's abuse. Prove the marriage was legitimate. If they could make it back to Montana alive. They arrived in Helena 2 days later, exhausted and trail-worn. The territorial courthouse was an imposing building of gray stone, 3 stories tall, with columns and carved cornices. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and low voices, the business of law grinding forward. Dan and Tommy found Barrett waiting outside the courtroom, Sarah beside him, dressed in her best clothes, her face tense with worry. When she saw Tommy, she ran to him, pulled him into a fierce embrace. Thank God, I thought. I'm fine, Mama. Dan protected me. Sarah looked over Tommy's head at Dan, her eyes shining with gratitude and something else, something that made Dan's chest tighten. Dr. Miller, on his way, should be here within the hour. They entered the courtroom, a high-ceilinged chamber with wooden benches and a raised platform where Judge Harrison presided. Marcus was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer in an expensive suit. When Marcus saw Sarah, his face twisted with rage and something darker. Possession. Control. Sarah moved closer to Dan, unconsciously seeking protection. Dan positioned himself between her and Marcus, his body a shield. Judge Harrison called the court to order. He was a man in his 60s, weathered and stern, with eyes that suggested he had seen every lie and truth the frontier could produce. This is a hearing to determine the validity of the marriage between Daniel Morgan and Sarah Morgan, formerly Hayes. But Hayes claims the marriage was fraudulent, entered into solely to circumvent his custody rights. Mr. Morgan, do you have representation? Dan stood. I represent myself, Your Honor. Marcus's lawyer, a man named Blackwell, rose. Your Honor, my client has provided substantial evidence that Mrs. Morgan was his legal wife until she abandoned him and kidnapped his 3 children. The marriage to Mr. Morgan occurred mere days after her flight, suggesting premeditation and fraud. Your Honor, Dan said, his voice steady, Sarah Hayes fled an abusive marriage, taking her children to protect them from a violent father. She married me to secure legal protection under Montana law. The marriage is legitimate, entered into freely by both parties. Abuse, Blackwell scoffed. A convenient claim with no evidence. My client has served his community honorably as a law enforcement officer for 12 years. Hayes has shown herself to be unstable, stealing money, and fleeing across territorial lines. I have evidence, Dan said. Dr. Henry Miller of Casper, Wyoming, treated Sarah Hayes multiple times for injuries consistent with domestic violence. He will testify. Where is Dr. Miller? Dan looked at Barrett, who shook his head slightly. Miller should have been here by now. Something was wrong. He's coming, Your Honor. We request a brief recess. Judge Harrison frowned. This court doesn't wait on absent witnesses. Present your evidence or concede the point. Before Dan could respond, the courtroom doors opened. Dr. Miller walked in, medical bag in hand, his face grave. Dr. Henry Miller, Your Honor, I apologize for my tardiness. I was detained. By whom? By men claiming to be federal marshals. When I showed them my court summons, they let me go. But the delay was intentional. Marcus's face remained impassive, but Dan saw the flicker of anger in his eyes. He had tried to stop Miller from testifying. Judge Harrison gestured Miller forward. The witness will be sworn. Miller took the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. Dan approached. Dr. Miller, how long have you practiced medicine in Casper? 23 years. And in that time, did you treat Sarah Hayes? Yes, multiple times over 8 years. For what injuries? Miller opened his medical bag, withdrew a leather-bound journal. I document every patient. Sarah Hayes first came to me in 1884. Bruises on her arms and face. She claimed she fell, but the pattern was inconsistent with a fall, consistent with being struck. Did you believe her? No, but I couldn't force her to admit the truth. Did she return? Many times. 1885 broken ribs, 1886 fractured jaw, 1887 severe bruising on her back and shoulders, always with explanations that didn't match the injuries. Dan took the journal, handed it to the judge. Your Honor, this is documentation of systematic abuse spanning 8 years. Judge Harrison examined the journal, his expression darkening. He looked at Marcus. Do you wish to respond? Marcus's lawyer stood. These are allegations, Your Honor. Dr. Miller admits Mrs. Hayes never claimed her husband abused her. Because she was afraid, Miller said, his voice rising. I saw that fear. I treated its consequences. Marcus Hayes beat his wife, and she was too terrified to report him. The courtroom murmured. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Order. Dan continued. The abuse is why Sarah fled, why she sought protection. The marriage to me is legitimate, born of necessity and mutual agreement. Your Honor, Blackwell interjected. Even if we accept these claims, there remains the issue of the stolen money, $500 taken from the Hayes family home. Sarah stood, her voice clear and firm. That money was not family savings. It was money Marcus stole from the county fund. I heard him tell another man, I took it to protect my children, thinking if Marcus came after us, I could prove he was the thief. Lies, Marcus said, speaking for the first time. His voice was cold, controlled. My wife is unstable, making wild accusations. The money was ours. She stole it. Can you prove it was yours? Judge Harrison asked. It was in my home, in a box it kept for savings. No bank records, no receipts. Cash savings, Your Honor, from my salary. Dan saw the trap. No paper trail, no way to prove the money's origin. Marcus's word against Sarah's. Then Tommy stood. Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Harrison looked surprised. You're a child. I'm Thomas Hayes, the oldest of the 3 children, and I have something to say. The judge considered, then nodded. The court will hear you. Tommy walked to the front, his young face set with determination. My father, Marcus Hayes, is a violent man. He beat my mother. He beat me. My sister Grace stopped talking for 3 months because she was so afraid of him. Marcus's lawyer started to object, but Judge Harrison waved him silent. I saw him counting that money, Tommy continued, the night before we left. He was talking to a man laughing about how they had robbed the county safe. Said no one would suspect the sheriff. When Mama took the money, she was taking evidence, not stealing. This is hearsay, Blackwell protested, the rambling of a child coached to lie. Your Honor, Dan said quietly, there's one person here who can prove Tommy's telling the truth. Everyone turned to look at the back of the courtroom. Grace stood there, held up by Lily, her small face pale but determined. She walked forward, each step deliberate, until she stood before the judge. And then for the second time since the trauma began, she spoke. Bad man, Papa Marcus. Bad man. Hit Mama. Hit Tommy. Make Grace scared. Her voice was small, halting, but it carried through the silent courtroom like a bell. Good man. Grace pointed at Dan. Papa Dan. Good man. Protect. Love. Safe. The courtroom erupted, people shouting. Marcus on his feet, face red with rage. The judge hammering his gavel, demanding order. When silence finally returned, Judge Harrison looked at Marcus with something like disgust. Mr. Hayes, I've heard enough. This court finds that Sarah Morgan's marriage to Daniel Morgan is legitimate and binding. Custody of the 3 children is hereby granted to Sarah Morgan and Daniel Morgan. Your parental rights are terminated. You can't do that, Marcus shouted. I just did. Furthermore, based on Dr. Miller's testimony and the statements of the children, I am issuing a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of domestic abuse. Sheriff Barrett, take Mr. Hayes into custody. Barrett moved forward, but Marcus was already backing toward the door, his hand moving to his gun. No, they're mine, my wife, my children. You can't take them. Marcus, don't, Barrett warned. But Marcus was beyond reason. He drew his pistol, pointed it not at Barrett or Dan, but at Sarah. If I can't have you, no one will. Dan moved without thinking, throwing himself between. The gun roared. Dan felt the impact like being hit with a hammer as the bullet struck his shoulder. He spun, fell his own gun, clearing leather. But he didn't fire. Because Tommy had drawn the rifle Dan had taught him to use, the Winchester from the cabin, and pointed it at Marcus. Drop it, Tommy said, his voice steady despite his shaking hands. Drop it, or I shoot. Marcus laughed, a sound edged with madness. You won't. You're just a boy. I'm my mother's son, and I protect my family. The shot echoed through the courtroom. Marcus screamed, his gun flying from his hand, a bloom of red spreading across his shoulder. Tommy had shot him, aimed true, just as Dan had taught. Barrett was on Marcus in seconds, wrestling him to the ground and snapping handcuffs on his wrists. Other deputies rushed in, helping to restrain the screaming, cursing former sheriff. Sarah was at Dan's side, her hands pressing against his wound, tears streaming down her face. You're shot. Oh, God, you're shot. It's not bad, Dan said, though pain was blooming across his chest. Went through, clean. Dr. Miller pushed forward, his professional calm taking over. Let me see. Tommy stood frozen, the rifle still in his hands, staring at what he had done. Dan reached up with his good arm, pulled the boy down beside him. You did good, son. You saved your mother. Saved all of us. I shot him. I shot Marcus. You defended your family, like I taught you. There's no shame in that. They took Marcus away, still screaming threats and curses. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only the Morgan family and Barrett. Dr. Miller bandaged Dan's shoulder, declared the wound painful but not dangerous. You'll heal, Miller said. Lucky man. Dan looked at Sarah, at Tommy, at Lily, and Grace standing together holding hands. His new family, not born of blood, but forged in crisis and sealed in courage. Yes, he said, I am. They left the courthouse as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Dan's shoulder throbbed, but Miller had given him laudanum for the pain. Sarah walked close beside him, Tommy on his other side, Lily and Grace between them. A family for the first time truly united. Barrett had arranged rooms at a hotel, a rare luxury. They would stay the night, let Dan rest, then ride back to the ranch in the morning. But as they entered the hotel, Dan felt the unease return. Something was wrong. Marcus was in jail, defeated. The trial was won. They should be safe. Yet every instinct Dan possessed, honed by years of hunting dangerous men, screamed danger. He pulled Barrett aside. Double the watch tonight. Marcus has friends, men who owe him. You think they'll try something? I know they will. Marcus is desperate, trapped. Men like that don't go quiet. Barrett nodded grimly. I'll put deputies on every entrance. No one gets in without being seen. That night, Dan lay in bed, his wounded shoulder aching despite the medicine. Sarah sat in a chair by the window watching the street below. They had put the children in the adjoining room, Tommy standing guard with the rifle. You should sleep, Dan said. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see Marcus pointing that gun. See him pulling the trigger. He missed. Because you moved, threw yourself in front of me. You almost died. But I didn't. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Why would you risk your life for me? We barely know each other. Dan was quiet for a long moment. Then because you deserve to live without fear. Because your children deserve a father who protects instead of hurts. Because he paused, searching for words. Because helping you is helping me heal. Elizabeth made me promise at the end, made me promise to live, to not let grief destroy me. I couldn't keep that promise until I had a reason. You and your children gave me that reason. Sarah crossed to the bed, sat on the edge. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to. I do. You've given us everything. Safety, hope, a future. She leaned down, kissed him gently. It was brief, tentative, a question more than a declaration. Dan felt surprise, then something warmer. Something he thought had died with Elizabeth. When Sarah pulled back, her face was flushed. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Don't be sorry. They looked at each other, the moment stretching full of possibility and uncertainty. Then footsteps pounded in the hallway outside. Someone hammered on the door. Dan, it's Barrett. We have a problem. Dan was up instantly, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He opened the door to find Barrett, his face grim. Marcus escaped 10 minutes ago, overpowered the guard, took his keys and gun. He's loose in Helena. Cold settled in Dan's gut. He's coming here. Already sent men to patrol the hotel. But Dan, there's more. The 2 men from Casper, the ones you wounded, they're in Helena. Saw them at a saloon an hour ago. If Marcus finds them, if they join forces, 3 armed men against us, in a hotel full of civilians. We need to move. Get you and the family somewhere safe. Dan shook his head. No time. He's probably already watching. If we try to leave, he'll ambush us on the street. Better to defend here. Choose our ground. He turned to Sarah. Get the children. Bring them here. We're going to fortify this room. Sarah moved without question, trusting his judgment. Tommy appeared moments later, rifle in hand, Lily and Grace behind him. Dan began moving furniture, building makeshift barricades. Barrett, how many deputies do you have? 4 in the building, 2 more outside. Pull them all inside. Let Marcus come to us. Dictate the terms of engagement. They worked quickly, turning the hotel room into a defensible position. Overturned beds for cover, the heavy wardrobe blocking the door. Windows watched, weapons loaded and ready. As they finished, a sound drifted up from the street below. Shouting, gunfire, then silence. Dan moved to the window, looked down. Bodies in the street, Barrett's deputies cut down by ambush. And walking toward the hotel, 3 figures. Marcus in the center, a pistol in each hand. The wounded men from Casper flanking him, rifles at the ready. They're here, Dan said quietly. The next minutes unfolded with terrible inevitability. Marcus and his men entered the hotel. More gunfire, screams, the sound of boots on stairs, then Marcus's voice echoing up the stairwell. Morgan, I know you're up there. Send down my wife and children, and I'll let you live. Dan didn't answer. Talking was pointless. Marcus had passed the point of reason. No. Then we're coming up, and anyone who gets in my way, D's. Dan positioned Tommy behind the overturned bed, gave him clear fields of fire. Put Sarah and the girls in the bathroom, the most defensible space with Barrett guarding the door. Then he took his position by the window, Colt in hand, and waited. The attack came with shocking speed. The door exploded inward, the lock shattered by rifle fire. Marcus came through first, guns blazing. Dan fired back his shot, catching Marcus in the leg, dropping him. But the 2 hired guns were right behind, spreading out, seeking targets. Tommy fired the Winchester, the shot going wide, but forcing one man to dive for cover. Barrett's pistol barked from the bathroom doorway, hitting the second man in the arm. For 30 seconds, the room was thunder and smoke and chaos. Then, as quickly as it began, silence fell. Dan assessed. One hired gun dead shot through the chest by Barrett. The second wounded but still dangerous pinned behind the wardrobe. And Marcus bleeding from his leg, dragging himself toward the bathroom where Sarah and the children hid. "No, you don't," Dan said, stepping over, pressing a boot onto Marcus's wounded leg. Marcus screamed, but the sound was rage as much as pain. "She's mine. They're all mine." "Not anymore." The wounded gunman chose that moment to make his move, lunging from behind the wardrobe, knife in hand. Dan turned too slow, the knife arcing toward his chest. Then a shot. Not from Dan's gun, not from Barrett's, from the bathroom doorway. Sarah stood there, a pistol in her trembling hands, smoke curling from the barrel. The gunman collapsed, the knife clattering from his dead fingers. Dan stared at her. Sarah stared back, shock and determination warring on her face. "No one threatens my family," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "No one." Marcus laughed, a sound tinged with madness. "You shot him. My good wife, the school teacher, is a killer now. How does it feel, Sarah, to have blood on your hands?" "Better than having your hate in my heart." More deputies arrived, drawn by the gunfire. They took Marcus into custody, this time with chains and an armed escort. The surviving gunman would recover, then face trial. It was over. Truly, finally over. As the chaos settled, as medical attention was given and statements taken, Dan found himself sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, exhaustion crashing over him. Sarah sat beside him, the pistol still in her lap. Her hands had stopped shaking, but she couldn't seem to let go of the weapon. "I killed a man," she said softly. "You protected your family. Is that what you tell yourself? When you remember the 12, every day, and every day I know it was necessary, just like this was necessary. Will it get easier?" Dan thought about the weight he carried, the faces he saw in dreams. "No, but you'll get stronger at carrying it." Tommy approached Lily and Grace behind him. All three children looked older, somehow aged by what they had witnessed, by what they had done and survived. "Is it over?" Tommy asked. "Yes," Dan said. "It's over." "What happens now?" Dan looked at Sarah, saw the question in her eyes. What happened now? They had married for legal protection, had fought for survival. But in the process, something had changed, something neither of them had expected. "Now we go home," Dan said, "to Morgan Ranch, all of us, and we build something that lasts." Sarah's hand found his, squeezed gently. "A family." "Yes, a family." Tommy smiled, the first real smile Dan had seen from the boy. Lily hugged Grace, who was crying, but not from fear, from relief, from release. They had won, against Marcus, against the law, against their own fears and doubts. And in winning, they had become something more than strangers thrown together by circumstance. They had become what they pretended to be, a family. The sun rose the next morning on a world changed. Marcus Hayes would spend the next 20 years in territorial prison. The charges were extensive: attempted murder, domestic abuse, theft, escape, assault on peace officers. He would die there unmourned and unremembered, except as a cautionary tale. But for the Morgan family riding north toward Montana, toward home, the future spread out bright and full of promise. Dan's shoulder would heal. Tommy's trauma would fade, replaced by strength and confidence. Lily and Grace would grow up safe, learn to laugh without fear. And Sarah would find peace, would remember what it meant to be happy. The journey back took 3 days. When they finally crested the ridge and saw Morgan Ranch below, smoke rising from the chimney, snow glittering in the sun, Sarah, "Home," Dan said softly. And it was. The ride home from Helena took 4 days instead of 3. Dan's shoulder wound, though clean, slowed them. Each movement sent pain radiating through his chest, reminding him of how close death had come. Sarah insisted they stop, frequently change his bandages, check for infection. Dr. Miller had given them supplies and strict instructions. Rest, clean water, no strain. Tommy rode point, his eyes scanning the horizon with new wariness. The boy had crossed the threshold in Helena, had fired a weapon in anger and hit his target. The weight of it showed in his face, in the way he held himself. He was not a child anymore, if he ever truly had been. Lily and Grace rode double on smoke, chattering to each other in the way children do, already processing trauma through play and imagination. Their resilience amazed Dan. They had witnessed violence, had heard their mother declare she would kill to protect them, had seen Marcus dragged away in chains. Yet here they were pointing at birds, making up stories about the clouds. Sarah rode beside Dan, her silence different from before. Not fearful now, but contemplative. She had killed a man. The knowledge sat heavy on her, visible in the set of her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. Dan understood. The first death was always the hardest to carry. On the third night, camped beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough for a touch, Sarah finally spoke of it. Does it ever stop, the replay in your mind? Dan was tending the fire, feeding it carefully to last through the cold night. No, but it changes, becomes less sharp, less immediate. How long? For me, years. But I killed 19 men, Sarah. You killed one. In defense of your family. That makes a difference. Does it? Dan looked at her across the flames. Yes, intent matters. The man you shot was trying to kill me. Kill your children. You stopped him. That's not murder. That's protection. Marcus said I was a killer now, said I had blood on my hands. Marcus was a monster who beat his wife and terrified his children. His opinion means nothing. Sarah smiled, small and sad. Strange, I spent 10 years believing his opinion was all that mattered. Now I'm free of him, and I don't know who I am. You're a mother, a survivor, a woman strong enough to do what needed doing, Dan paused. And you're my wife, for whatever that's worth. Sarah met his eyes across the fire. It's worth a great deal. The moment stretched, full of unspoken things. Then Tommy returned from checking the horses, breaking the spell, and they prepared for sleep. Morgan Ranch came into view on the afternoon of the fourth day. The cabin stood solid against the winter sky, smoke rising from the chimney where Barrett had kept the fires burning. The barn was intact, the fences mended, everything as they had left it. But it felt different now. Not just a house, but a home. Not just land, but legacy. Barrett emerged from the cabin as they rode up, relief plain on his weathered face. Thank God. Got your telegram from Helena. Wasn't sure you'd make it back. Almost didn't, Dan said, dismounting carefully, favoring his injured shoulder. They gathered in the main room, the fire warm and welcoming. Barrett had kept everything clean, had even cooked a stew that simmered on the stove, filling the cabin with rich smells. Over dinner, they told him everything. The trial, Marcus's escape, the fight in the hotel, Sarah shooting the hired gun, Marcus's final capture. Barrett listened, his expression darkening. 20 years. That's what the judge gave him. Plus charges pending for the deputies he killed. He'll die in prison. Good. Barrett looked at Sarah. You're free of him. Truly. Sarah nodded, but Dan saw the doubt in her eyes. Freedom was harder to believe than captivity, when captivity was all you had known. After Barrett left, promising to check in weekly, the family settled into their first night of peace. Real peace, not the fragile, temporary kind they had known before, but the solid certainty that comes from battles fought and won. Tommy helped Dan bank the fire for the night, learning the careful balance of heat and fuel that would keep them warm until morning. Dan, the boy's voice was quiet. When I shot Marcus, when I pulled that trigger, I wanted to hurt him, wanted him to feel pain. Does that make me bad? Dan set down the poker, turned to face Tommy fully. It makes you human. Marcus hurt people you love. Hurt you. Wanting him to pay for that is natural. But you said a man should protect, not seek revenge. I did, and I meant it. But there's a difference between revenge and justice. You didn't shoot Marcus to make him suffer. You shot him to stop him from killing your mother. That's justice. Tommy considered this, his young face serious in the firelight. I don't want to be like him. Like Marcus. Angry and cruel. You won't be. You know why? Dan put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Because you're asking the question. Marcus never questioned himself. Never doubted that he had the right to hurt others. You're already better than he was. The tension in Tommy's shoulders eased. Will you keep teaching me everything your father taught you? Everything I know. How to work the land. How to build things that last. How to be a man worth respecting. And how to protect. That too, but remember, Tommy, the best protection is preventing fights before they start. Violence is always the last resort. And they finished with the fire in comfortable silence. As they prepared for bed, Dan noticed Sarah standing by the window of the bedroom, staring out at the moonlit snow. He joined her, his shoulder aching, but manageable. Can't sleep. I keep expecting him to appear, to come through that door with a gun shouting that we're his property. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I know he's locked away. I know he can't, but the fear is still here. Fear takes time to fade, longer than wounds heal. How do you do it? How do you live with what you've done? Dan thought about Deadwood, about 12 bodies cooling in the street, about the faces he still saw in dreams. I remember why I did it. I remember the people I saved, the innocent lives protected, and I try to build something good with the time I have left. Is that what we are, your attempt to build something good? No. Dan turned to face her. You're not my attempt at anything. You're my second chance. You and your children. You're proof that a man can change, can be more than his worst moments. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly she leaned against him, her head resting on his uninjured shoulder. Dan stiffened, surprised, then relaxed. Let himself accept the comfort of another person's warmth. They stood that way until the moon set and exhaustion claimed them both. Winter released its grip slowly, reluctantly. February passed in a blur of snow and cold, the family settling into routines. Dan taught Tommy to work leather to repair tack and boots. Sarah taught all three children to read and write using Dan's books, turning the cabin into a schoolhouse each afternoon. In early March, a telegram arrived. The Yellowstone Land Company had been dissolved, its fraudulent claims exposed. Marcus Hayes had been one of three partners, using stolen money to buy land along the planned railroad route. With Marcus in prison and the other partners fleeing to avoid prosecution, the company's assets were seized. Dan's land was secure, all 160 acres confirmed and recorded. The ranch was his legally and completely to pass down as his father and grandfather had intended. The news called for celebration. Sarah baked a cake, precious sugar and flour transformed into sweetness. They ate it by firelight, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, giddy with relief and safety. That night after the children slept, Dan and Sarah talked long into the darkness. What do we do now? Sarah asked. The marriage was for legal protection. Marcus is gone. Do we? She didn't finish, but Dan understood the question. Do we end it? I don't know. What do you want? Dan thought about the past months, about waking to the sound of children's laughter, about Sarah's cooking, filling the cabin with warmth, about Tommy working beside him, eager to learn, about Lily's questions and Grace's shy smiles. I want you to stay, he said finally. All of you. Not because of papers or legal necessity, but because this cabin has been empty for 3 years, because I've been empty, and you've filled that emptiness with life. Dan, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. If you want separate bedrooms, we do that. If you want time to heal, we take time. But don't leave, please. Make this your home, really and truly. Sarah's eyes glistened in the firelight. I'm afraid. Of me, of trusting, of believing this is real. 10 years with Marcus taught me that kindness is temporary, that men change, that safety is an illusion. Dan reached across the space between them, offered his hand. I won't change, won't hurt you, won't use strength to control. That's my promise, and I keep my promises. Sarah looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she took it, her fingers small and cold in his. I want to believe you. Then stay. Give me time to prove it. All right, Sarah whispered. We'll stay. Spring arrived in April, sudden and overwhelming. Snow melted in rushing torrents, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Birds returned, filling the air with song. The world transformed from white stillness to bursting life. Dan threw himself into work, preparing for the growing season. Fields to plow, fences to check and repair. The barn roof needed patching where winter had torn shingles loose. Tommy worked beside him every day, his hands becoming calloused and strong. One morning in late April, Dan found Sarah at the eastern window, watching the sunrise, her hand pressed to her stomach. Are you all right? She turned, her face pale but smiling. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Dan felt his chest tighten, a mixture of joy and fear and wonder. How long have you known? A month, maybe more. I wasn't sure, but now. She touched her stomach again. Now I'm certain. Dan crossed to her, hardly daring to believe. A baby. Are you happy? Happy, Sarah. He struggled for words. I thought I'd never have this again. After Jacob. After Elizabeth. I thought that part of my life was over. And now I have a second chance. At everything. Dan put his hand over hers on her stomach. Thank you. Sarah laughed, the sound bright and free. Thank you, Dan. It wakes two people to make a baby. I know, but you're giving me something I thought I'd lost forever. The chance to be a father again. To watch a child grow. To pass on what my father taught me. They stood together in the morning light, husband and wife, expecting parents, their future suddenly full of possibility. When they told the children that evening, reactions varied. Tommy looked shocked, then thoughtful, processing what it meant to have a younger sibling. Lily clapped her hands with delight, immediately planning what to teach the baby. Grace smiled, her healing voice clear when she said, "Baby sister." How do you know it's a sister? Sarah asked, amused. Grace just smiled her mysterious smile and said nothing more. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Sarah bloomed in the spring warmth, her body rounding her face, taking on a glow that Dan found beautiful. He had missed this with Jacob had been away hunting outlaws during much of Elizabeth's pregnancy. Now he was here present for every change, every milestone. He found himself planning obsessively. The room where Lily and Grace slept would need to be bigger. They could add on to the cabin, extend it north where the foundation was strongest. He would need to build a cradle, find soft blankets, make sure everything was ready. Tommy caught him one day measuring wood for the cradle, muttering calculations. You're nervous. Dan looked up, startled. What? About the baby, you're nervous, I can tell. Is it that obvious? A little. Tommy sat on the workbench watching Dan work. Were you nervous before Jacob was born? Terrified. I was 28 years old and had no idea how to be a father. I kept thinking I would do it wrong, break him somehow. Did you do it wrong? Every day. But Elizabeth helped. She was patient, kind. She taught me that being a father wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, being consistent, being there when he needed me. Dan paused, his throat tight. I failed him at the end. Wasn't there when he needed me most. That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? I chose to leave that day. Chose to ride to town for medicine when I could have sent someone else. Jacob died because of my choices. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, Grace almost stopped talking forever because of Marcus. Lily has nightmares where she's trapped and can't escape. I jumped at shadows for months after we left. We're all damaged by what Marcus did, by choices he made. That's different. Is it Marcus chose a cruelty? You chose to try to save your wife. One is evil, the other is love. You can't blame yourself for loving. Dan sat down. His tools really looked at Tommy. When had this boy become so wise? When had he learned to see past pain to truth? Your mother did a good job raising you. She did. But you're teaching me too. Teaching me what a father should be. Should have been. Tommy slid off the workbench. When this baby comes, you'll be a good father. I know it. Because you already are. He left Dan alone in the barn, surrounded by wood shavings and half-built dreams, his eyes burning with tears he didn't try to hide. Sarah's labor began on a cool evening in November, exactly 9 months after Helena. Dan sent Tommy riding for the doctor in Coldwater, then paced the cabin like a caged animal, while Lily boiled water and Grace held her mother's hand with surprising calm. The hours stretched. Night fell. The doctor arrived, a capable woman named Margaret Chen, who had delivered half the babies in the county. She examined Sarah, pronounced everything progressing normally, and told Dan to either help or get out of the way. Dan chose help. He held Sarah's hand, whispered encouragement, wiped sweat from her forehead. He had missed this with Jacob, had been in a saloon 50 miles away when Elizabeth gave birth. Now he was present for every moment, every cry, every push. Just before midnight, with a final wrenching effort, Sarah delivered a baby boy. Dr. Chen caught him, cleared his airway, and the cabin filled with the sound of new life crying. A son, the doctor said, handing the squirming bundle to Sarah, healthy and loud. Sarah cradled the baby, tears streaming down her face. Hello, little one. Hello. Dan looked at his son, his second son, and felt his heart crack open. The baby was red and wrinkled and perfect. his tiny fist waving his mouth open in protest at being thrust into the cold world. "What will you name him?" Dr. Cheney asked, cleaning up efficiently. Sarah looked at Dan. "Jacob, if that's all right with you." Dan could barely speak past the lump in his throat. "Jacob Morgan, second of his name." "Jacob Morgan," Sarah repeated, looking down at the baby. "Welcome to the family." Tommy, Lily, and Grace crowded close, wanting to see their new brother. Grace reached out one small finger, touched Jacob's tiny hand. The baby's fingers closed around hers, gripping tight. "See," Grace said triumphantly. "Baby brother, not sister. Grace was wrong." Everyone laughed, the sound bright and full of joy. The next months passed in a haze of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Jacob was a demanding baby, crying at odd hours, needing constant care. But Dan didn't mind. Every midnight feeding, every diaper change, every moment spent rocking his son to sleep was a gift he had thought lost forever. He watched Sarah with the baby, saw her natural grace, her infinite patience. She sang lullabies in a voice soft and sweet, taught Lily and Grace how to hold their brother safely, showed Tommy how to test bottles for temperature. They were a family, not bound by blood in every case, but by choice and love and shared survival, stronger for what they had endured, richer for what they had built together. One morning in December, exactly 1 year after he had found Sarah and her children freezing in the snow, Dan woke to find the cabin transformed. Sarah and the children had decorated while he slept, hanging pine boughs and red berries filling the space with the scent of winter and celebration. "What's all this?" "It's our anniversary," Sarah said, nursing Jacob by the fire. "1 year since you saved us. 1 year since we came home." Dan felt warmth spread through his chest. Home. Yes, that's what this is. That afternoon, they held a small ceremony, just the family with Barrett as witness. Dan and Sarah renewed their vows this time, meaning every word not as legal protection, but as genuine commitment. "I, Daniel Morgan, take you, Sarah Morgan, to be my wife, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, to love and cherish until death parts us. I, Sarah Morgan, take you, Daniel Morgan, to be my husband, to trust and honor, to build a life alongside, to love without fear or reservation." Pastor Miller, who had made the journey from Coldwater, pronounced them married. Again. But different this time. Real. They exchanged rings, the gold band that had been Elizabeth's, now sitting comfortably on Sarah's finger, as if it had always belonged there. Dan wore a new ring, simple silver, forged by the blacksmith in town, inscribed inside with words Sarah had chosen: strength, honor, love. After Miller left, they gathered around the table for a feast Sarah had spent days preparing. Roasted chicken potatoes, fresh bread, apple pie made from the fruit Dan had dried last fall. Tommy stood raising his glass of cider. A toast to family, to second chance, to the man who saved us and became our father. "To Papa, Dan," Lily echoed. "To Papa." Grace added, her voice clear and strong. Dan looked around the table at the faces turned toward him with love and trust. His family, his legacy, his second chance at everything that mattered. "To family," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To all of you, thank you for giving me a reason to live again." They drank the sweetness of cider, mixing with the salt of happy tears. The years passed like water, each one bringing changes. Growth, new challenges, met and overcome. In the spring of Dan's 43rd year, they expanded the cabin, adding 3 new rooms. Tommy, now 13 and tall as a man, helped with every nail and board, learning construction the way he had learned everything else from Dan, with careful attention and growing skill. Lily was 10, bright and curious, reading every book in Dan's small library twice over and begging for more. Dan rode to Helena once a month, returning with new volumes on history, science, poetry. Lily devoured them all. Grace was 8, still quiet but no longer silent. She spoke when she had something to say, her words chosen carefully, carrying weight. She had a gift for animals, could calm a spooked horse with a touch, knew when the cows were sick before anyone else noticed. And Jacob, now 4 years old, was a whirlwind of energy and questions. He followed Tommy everywhere, mimicking his older brother's every move. When Tommy chopped wood, Jacob picked up a stick and pretended to chop. When Tommy checked fences, Jacob toddled behind, examining every post with serious concentration. Dan watched his children grow with a mixture of pride and poignant awareness of time's passage. Jacob looked nothing like his namesake, was dark where the first Jacob had been, fair, loud, where the first had been gentle. But Dan loved him completely, this boy who carried a dead child's name forward into the future. Sarah bloomed in the mountain air and freedom. She had put on healthy weight, her face no longer gaunt with fear and hunger. She laughed often, saying while she worked touched Dan with casual affection that still surprised and pleased him. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch Dan had built, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. "Do you ever miss teaching?" Dan asked one night. "Sometimes. I loved it helping children learn." Sarah leaned against him, comfortable and easy. "But I'm teaching now. Our children. It's enough. What if you wanted to teach more? We could build a schoolhouse, offer classes to the other ranch families. Their children need education too." Sarah turned to look at him, surprise and hope warring on her face. "You would do that, build a school. For you, anything." The schoolhouse went up the next summer, a simple building at the edge of Morgan property, big enough for 20 students. Sarah taught reading, writing, mathematics, history. Children came from ranches 10 miles around, eager to learn. Tommy helped teach the older boys practical skills, woodworking and animal husbandry, passing on what Dan had taught him. At 15, he was a capable young man, strong and confident, no trace left of the frightened boy who had faced down his mother's abuser. One evening as they worked together repairing fence line, Tommy broached a subject Dan had been expecting. "I want to go to school, real school, in Denver or Helena, learn engineering." Dan continued stretching wire, his face carefully neutral. "Why engineering?" "Because I want to build things, big things, bridges, buildings, things that help people." Tommy paused. "Things that last. Like your grandfather, my father. Like both of them. Like you." Tommy secured the wire, tested its tension. "Will you be angry if I leave?" "Angry, numb, proud. Terrified you'll get hurt or lost or forget your way home. But not angry." "I won't forget. This is home, always will be." "I know, but still, you're my son. Letting you go will be one of the hardest things I've ever done." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm not your real son, not by blood." Dan set down his tools, turned to face the boy fully. "You are my son in every way that matters. I taught you, raised you, watched you grow from a frightened child into a good man. Blood doesn't make a father. Love does. Commitment does. Being there does. Then I'm lucky, because I have two fathers, one who gave me life, one who taught me how to live it." They embraced the fence, forgotten, two men acknowledging the bond that connected them. That fall, Tommy left for the technical college in Denver. The family rode with him to Coldwater, where he would catch the stage south. Sarah cried, clutching her firstborn, unwilling to let go. Lily and Grace hugged him fiercely. Jacob, not understanding, asked when Tommy would be home for dinner. "Next summer," Tommy promised. "I'll come home every summer, and I'll write every week." Dan shook his son's hand, then pulled him into an embrace. "Make us proud, but more importantly, make yourself proud. Be the man you were meant to be." "I will, Papa." The words, simple and profound, nearly broke Dan. Tommy had never called him Papa before, had always used his name, maintaining a careful distance. But now, at the moment of leaving, he claimed the relationship fully. "Go on then," Dan said, his voice rough. "Miss that stage, and you'll have to walk." They watched the stage pull away, Tommy's face visible in the window until distance swallowed him. Then they rode home, the family smaller but no less bound together. Winter came again, the cabin quieter without Tommy's presence. But his letters arrived faithfully every week, full of descriptions of Denver and his studies and his plans for the future. In the spring, Sarah announced she was pregnant again. Dan had thought they were done, that Jacob would be their last. But life, it seemed, had other plans. This time the pregnancy was harder. Sarah was 38 now, no longer young. She tired easily, needed more rest. Dan hovered protective and worried until Sarah finally snapped at him to stop treating her like glass. The baby arrived in October, another boy smaller and frailer than Jacob had been. They named him Samuel after Sarah's father and watched him carefully through his first difficult months. But Samuel was a fighter. He grew stronger, filled out, became a happy, gurgling baby who smiled at everyone. By his first birthday, he was robust and healthy, crawling everywhere, getting into everything. Dan was 45 now, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined by sun and wind and time. but he felt younger than he had at 30, filled with purpose and joy. He had his family, his land, his legacy, everything he needed. The years flowed like water down the mountains, each one adding to the depth and richness of the Morgan family story. Tommy returned each summer bringing tales of Denver and his progress. In his fourth year, he brought a young woman named Catherine, a teacher's daughter, with intelligent eyes and a ready smile. They married the following spring in a ceremony on Morgan Ranch, the whole county in attendance. Tommy took his bride back to Denver, but promised they would return when he finished his studies. "I want to build here," he told Dan. "Montana needs engineers, needs people who understand the land. I can help." Lily, at 16, announced her intention to become a doctor. Dan had laughed at first, thinking it a passing fancy, but Lily was serious, had already been corresponding with female doctors in Boston and New York, learning what she would need to study. "Women can be doctors," she insisted. "Dr. Chen proved that. I can too." Sarah supported her daughter's ambition. Dan, after initial surprise, came around. If his daughter wanted to heal people, who was he to stand in her way? Grace, at 14, showed no interest in leaving the ranch. She worked with the animals, had a gift for breeding that increased the herd's size and health. She could look at a horse and know if it was sound, could treat illnesses Dan couldn't even diagnose. "I'll stay here," she told Dan one evening. "Someone needs to keep the ranch going when you're old." "When I'm old, I'm not old now." Grace smiled, her rare smile that lit her whole face. "You're middle old, getting older. Someday you'll need help. I'll be here." Jacob, now 8, was pure Morgan. He loved the land, loved working with his hands, loved listening to Dan's stories about his grandfather and great-grandfather. He soaked up knowledge like a sponge, remembered everything, asked endless questions. "Tell me about when great-grandpa first came here," he would demand. "Tell me about building the cabin. Tell me about the first winter." Dan told him, passing down the stories, ensuring the legacy continued. Samuel, at 4, was the baby spoiled by everyone, bright and cheerful and fearless. He climbed everything, explored everywhere, gave Sarah daily heart attacks with his adventures. On a warm evening in June, Dan's 48th year, they held a celebration. Tommy had returned from Denver, his studies complete, his wife Catherine pregnant with their first child. The whole family gathered, 3 generations now filling the expanded cabin with noise and laughter. They sat around the large table Dan's father had built, eating Sarah's cooking, telling stories, planning the future. Tommy announced he was opening an engineering firm in Helena, would be designing bridges and buildings across Montana. Lily had been accepted to medical school in Boston, would leave in the fall. Grace had bred a new line of horses, sturdy and strong, perfectly suited to Montana winters. Jacob had built a birdhouse, precise and beautiful proof of his growing skill. Samuel had learned to write. His name was enormously proud of this accomplishment. After dinner, as the children played outside, Dan and Sarah walked to the family cemetery, a small plot on a hill overlooking the ranch. 2 graves rested there side by side: Elizabeth Morgan, Jacob Morgan. Dan had maintained them, carefully kept the grass trimmed, the headstones clean. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Dan spoke. "Elizabeth, Jacob, I want you to meet someone, several someones." Sarah took his hand, lending her support. "This is Sarah, my wife. She's strong and kind and everything you would have wanted from me. She saved me the way you did, gave me reason to keep living." His voice caught, but he continued. "And these are our children. Tommy, who I taught to be a man. Lily, who wants to heal the world. Grace, who understands the land. Jacob, named for his brother carrying him forward. And Samuel, our surprise, our joy." Tears ran down Dan's face, but they were not only sad tears. "I haven't forgotten you. Never will. You're part of me, part of this legacy. But I've moved forward like you wanted. Like you wrote in your last words, Elizabeth. I've lived, I've loved again. I've been the father you knew I could be." Sarah spoke then, her voice gentle. "Thank you for loving him, for showing him what love could be. I promise to honor that, to be worthy of this family." They stood together as the sun set, 2 people honoring the past while embracing the future. When they returned to the cabin, Tommy was waiting with news. Catherine had felt the baby move strong and healthy. They were having a son, planned to name him Daniel. Dan felt his chest swell with emotion. His grandson would carry his name. The legacy would continue. That night, unable to sleep, Dan went to his father's journal, opened to a blank page at the back, and began to write. June 18th, 1898. To my children and grandchildren and all who come after. I am Daniel Morgan, son of William Morgan, grandson of Samuel Morgan, who founded this ranch in 1855. I write this so you will know where you come from. Know what this land cut, know what it means to be a Morgan. A man builds his legacy not with what he takes, but with what he gives. Land, knowledge, honor. These are the things that last. I have made mistakes, killed men, failed people I loved, carried guilt that weighed heavier than mountains. But I have also protected, built, loved, raised children who will make the world better. If you read this, know that you are the product of 3 generations of Morgans who worked this land, who fought to keep it, who passed it down with pride. Care for it as we did. Honor it. And when your time comes, pass it to the next generation with the same love and commitment we gave to you. The ranch is more than property. It is proof that we mattered, that we built something lasting, that we chose honor over ease, family over selfishness, love over fear. Be worthy of it. Be worthy of the name Morgan. And know that I loved you all, even those I never met. You are my legacy, my immortality, my answer to death's certainty. Live well, love deeply, leave the world better than you found it. That is the Morgan way. He signed it, dated it, closed the journal. Someday Tommy would read it, would pass it to his son Daniel. Who would pass it to his children? The words connecting past and future, binding generations in shared purpose and pride. Dan returned to bed, found Sarah waiting. Jacob and Samuel curled between them, seeking comfort in sleep. He lay down carefully, not wanting to wake them, and Sarah's hand found his in the darkness. What were you doing? Writing for the future. What did you write? That we matter, that love survives death, that family is everything. Sarah squeezed his hand. Yes, all true. They lay together, surrounded by their children, the cabin quiet around them. Outside, the Montana night was vast and full of stars, the land they had fought for stretching away in all directions. Dan closed his eyes and thought about the journey. From the Montana ghost feared and alone to Daniel Morgan, husband and father, teacher and builder. From a man running from his past to a man creating a future. From death and guilt to life and grace. He had been given a second chance, had used it to build something that would outlast him, had passed on not just property, but values, not just land, but legacy. In the darkness, he smiled. His children would grow, would leave and return, would build their own families, would face their own challenges. But they would face them as Morgans, with the strength and honor their ancestors had bequeathed them. Tommy would build bridges that lasted centuries. Lily would save lives, heal wounds, ease suffering. Grace would maintain the ranch, keep it in the family, pass it to her children. Jacob would craft beauty with his hands, creating things of lasting worth. Samuel would find his own path, would add his own chapter to the Morgan story. And Dan would watch it all unfold, would guide, where he could support, always love without reservation. He had been a hunter once, a taker of life. Now he was a builder, a giver of life. The transformation was complete. As sleep claimed him, his last thought was of Elizabeth, of the promise he had made over her grave. To live, to love again, to be there when needed. He had kept that promise, and in keeping it had found redemption. The sun rose the next morning on Morgan Ranch, painting the mountains gold, driving back the darkness, bringing warmth and light to the valley. Dan woke to the sound of his children stirring, Sarah humming as she started breakfast, the familiar routine of another day beginning. He rose dressed, prepared to face whatever the day would bring. Because that was what a Morgan did. Endured, built, loved, generation after generation after generation. Forever, the old man sat on the porch of Morgan Ranch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, his hands gnarled with arthritis. But his eyes were still sharp, his mind still clear. Daniel Morgan, 68 years old, husband, father, grandfather, builder of legacies. Around him, family gathered. 3 generations, 4 if you counted the baby. Catherine held Daniel's great-granddaughter born just last month. Tommy was 37 now, distinguished and successful, his engineering firm one of the most respected in Montana. He had designed half the bridges in the territory buildings that would stand for centuries. His son Daniel, 14, was following in his footsteps, already showing promise as a young student of engineering. Grace had never left the ranch. She had married a rancher from the next valley, had 5 children, all of them as comfortable with animals as she was. They had expanded the herd to over 200 head, made Morgan Ranch one of the most productive in the region. Jacob, now 27, was a master craftsman, his furniture and artwork sought after across the territory. His pieces would be treasured for generations, proof of skill passed down from father to son to grandson. Samuel, the baby, was 25 now, tall and handsome, newly returned from the war in Europe. He had seen terrible things, carried new weight in his eyes, but had survived. Was home. Lily had returned from Boston, a doctor of considerable skill and reputation, now running a clinic in Helena. She had married a few years prior to a surgeon who shared her passion for medicine. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "That I'm grateful for all of it, the good and the bad, the pain and the joy. All of it led here, to this moment, to this family." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in impossible colors. The ranch spread out below them, 160 acres of legacy and love, 3 generations of Morgans, having worked this land, built on it, loved on it, passed it forward with pride. Tommy approached, sat on the step below Dan's chair. "Tell us again, Papa, about the day you met Mama and my siblings in the snow." Dan smiled. How many times had he told this story? Hundreds, thousands? It never grew old. It was December 1892, the coldest winter I could remember. I was alone, then had been alone for 3 years. Thought I would die alone. Then I heard shouting at the market. The family gathered, close children and grandchildren, even though they knew the story by heart. Because this wasn't just a story, it was their origin. The moment their family began. Dan told it all. The market, the storm, the cabin, Marcus, the trial, the fight, the victory, the years after building and growing and loving. When he finished, the sun had set, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. And that, Dan said, is how the Montana ghost became Daniel Morgan, how a killer became a father, how a man running from his past found his future. Young Daniel, Tommy's son, spoke up. "Will you tell your children?" "When you're old," Dan looked at his grandson. "Yes, and they'll tell theirs, and on and on. So no one ever forgets where we came from, what we survived, what we built." "The legacy," Tommy said. "The legacy," Dan agreed. Later, after everyone had gone inside for the night, Dan and Sarah remained on the porch. Too old to care about the cold, too comfortable to want to move. "When I'm gone," Dan said, "Tommy will take over the ranch. He'll do well, better than I did." "Don't talk about being gone. You are not going anywhere. We're both old, Sarah. Our time is coming. Then we'll face it together, like we've faced everything." Dan took her hand, thin and fragile now, but still strong in the ways that mattered. "I love you. Should have said it more often. You showed it every day. That's better than words." They sat together as the stars multiplied overhead, as the night deepened, as the world turned, and time flowed ever forward. Inside the cabin, their family slept 3 generations under one roof, bound by love and shared history. Tomorrow they would scatter again and return to their own lives and homes. But tonight they were all here, all together, proof of what one man's choice could create. One decision to help a stranger, to open his home, to offer protection. From that single choice, a family had grown, a legacy had been built, and Daniel Morgan, former gunfighter and killer, had found his redemption. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming again, as it always did. But the cabin would be warm, the family would survive, the legacy would continue, forever and always. Morgan Ranch, established 1855, built on honor, passed with pride, grown with love.